Greetings, brave warriors and shield maidens. If you seek the strength and wisdom of the ancient Vikings, you've come to the right place. Don't waste time. Subscribe to the channel now and join our horde to strengthen this community of true Vikings. As you can see, our channel is new, so your subscription is crucial to our growth. If you're a true fan of the Vikings, show your support. Let the power of the Viking axe guide your hand to click the like button, and in the comments, tell us which city you're watching from so we know where in the world our stories are reaching, all because the fjord lay still as glass, mirroring the towering cliffs and snow-capped peaks that surrounded the village of Ravenholm. The early morning mist clung to the water's surface, slowly dissipating as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Bjorn Frostbeard stood at the water's edge, his calloused hands gripping the haft of his axe as he stared out at the horizon. At 25 winters, Bjorn was in his prime, tall and broad-shouldered, with a thick red beard that had earned him his nickname. His blue eyes, as clear and cold as glacier ice, scanned the fjord restlessly. He had been on raids before, had tasted the thrill of battle and the sweetness of plunder, but something gnawed at him, an insatiable hunger for more. "Bjorn!" a voice called from behind him. "Stop daydreaming and help with the nets." He turned to see his younger brother Ulf struggling with a tangle of fishing nets. With a sigh, Bjorn shouldered his axe and moved to help. "Always with your head in the clouds," Ulf grumbled as they worked to untangle the mess. "What good is dreaming when there's work to be done?" Bjorn's hands moved deftly, freeing knots with practiced ease. "There's more to life than just fishing and raiding, Ulf. Don't you ever wonder what lies beyond the horizon?" Ulf snorted. "Beyond the horizon? More water, more land, more people to raid. What else is there?" Before Bjorn could respond, a commotion from the village center caught their attention. People were gathering, their voices rising in excitement and concern. "Come on," Bjorn said, dropping the nets. "Something's happening." They jogged towards the crowd, pushing their way through until they reached the center. There, standing before the great hall, was Astrid Ravenhair, the village seeress. Her long black hair whipped around her face in a wind that seemed to touch no one else, and her eyes were wide and unfocused. "I have seen it," she cried, her voice carrying an otherworldly resonance. "The gods have shown me a vision of our fate." Jarl Eric Stormborn emerged from the great hall, his presence commanding immediate respect. Though well into his 50s, Eric was still an imposing figure, his beard streaked with gray but his eyes sharp and alert. "Speak, Astrid," he said, his deep voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "What have the gods revealed to you?" Astrid's gaze snapped to Eric, and when she spoke, her words sent a chill through the assembled villagers. "I saw our people, Jarl Eric, withering like leaves in autumn. Our stores run empty, our ships rot in the harbor, and our children cry with hunger. But in the far north, in a land of endless ice and snow, I saw hope, a new beginning for our people." The crowd erupted in whispers and exclamations. Bjorn felt his heart race, a surge of excitement coursing through him. This was it. The opportunity. "These are grave tidings, Astrid, but we cannot act on visions alone. I call for a thing to be held at midday. We will discuss this as a community and decide our course." As the crowd dispersed, buzzing with speculation, Bjorn turned to Ulf. "This is our chance, brother. A new land, ripe for the taking." Ulf looked skeptical. "A land of ice and snow? It sounds like a frozen hell, not a new beginning." Bjorn gripped his brother's shoulder. "Where's your sense of adventure? This could be our opportunity to become more than just raiders and fishermen." Ulf shrugged off Bjorn's hand. "I'm content with what we have here. Not all of us need to be heroes, brother." As Ulf walked away, Bjorn's attention was drawn to Astrid, who was now standing alone, her eyes closed as if in deep concentration. He approached her cautiously. "Astrid," he said softly, "may I speak with you?" Her eyes opened, focusing on him with an intensity that made him want to step back. "Bjorn Frostbeard," she said, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. "I wondered when you would come to me." "Your vision," Bjorn began, then hesitated. Is it truly as you said? A new beginning in the north? Astrid's expression grew serious. What I saw was both promise and peril, Bjorn. The north holds great opportunity for our people, but also dangers beyond imagining. The path ahead is shrouded in mist, but I sense that you have a role to play in what is to come. Bjorn's pulse quickened at her words. Tell me more. What must I do? Astrid placed a hand on his arm, and Bjorn felt a jolt of energy pass between them. Prepare yourself, Bjorn Frostbeard. When the thing is called, you must be ready to step forward. The journey ahead will require not just strength of arm, but strength of will and character. Are you prepared for such a test? Bjorn stood straighter, his resolve hardening. I am, Astrid. I've been waiting for a chance like this my whole life. She nodded, a knowing look in her eyes. Then go. Prepare yourself for the thing. And Bjorn, she added as he turned to leave, remember that the gods favor the bold, but they also punish the foolhardy. Wisdom must temper your courage. With those words echoing in his mind, Bjorn hurried to his home to gather his thoughts and prepare for the thing. The small wooden house he shared with Ulf was cluttered with the tools of their trade: fishing nets, woodworking implements, and weapons for raiding. As he moved about collecting his finest clothes and his ceremonial weapons, his mind raced with possibilities. Midday approached swiftly, and soon the sound of the great horn echoed across Ravnholm, calling all free men to the thing. Bjorn made his way to the assembly ground, a flat area near the shore where a circle of stones marked the sacred space of community decision-making. Jarl Erik stood in the center, his presence commanding attention. The villagers gathered around, their faces a mix of excitement, fear, and curiosity. Bjorn found a spot near the front, his heart pounding with anticipation. People of Ravnholm, Erik began, his voice carrying across the assembly. We face a crossroads. For generations we have lived and thrived in these lands, but now we hear whispers of hardship to come. Astrid Ravenhair has brought us a vision from the gods, a warning of lean times ahead, but also a promise of new beginnings in the frozen north. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Erik continued, We must decide our path. Do we stay and face whatever hardships may come, or do we risk everything on a journey into the unknown? An older man, Gunnar the Smith, spoke up. Jarl Erik, we have weathered hard times before. Why should we abandon our homes on the word of a vision? Because this time is different, Astrid interjected, stepping forward. The signs are clear for those who know how to read them. Our raids bring less bounty each year, our crops grow thin, and the fish become scarce. The gods are telling us it is time to seek new lands. Debate erupted among the assembled villagers. Some voiced support for a great expedition, while others argued passionately for staying and fortifying their current holdings. Bjorn listened intently, waiting for the right moment to speak. As the arguments began to circle back on themselves, Bjorn saw his opportunity. He stepped forward, raising his voice to be heard above the clamor. My fellow Northmen, hear me, he called out. The crowd quieted, turning to look at the young warrior. I, Bjorn Frostbeard, stand ready to lead an expedition to these northern lands. We are Vikings, are we not? Explorers, adventurers, conquerors. Our ancestors did not shrink from the unknown. They embraced it, and in doing so, they built the world we know today. He paused, looking around at the faces of his community. Some nodded in agreement, others looked skeptical, but all were listening. I propose this. Let us send a small expedition to scout these new lands. If Astrid's vision proves true, we will have taken the first step towards a new future for our people. If not, we will have lost little and gained valuable knowledge of the world beyond our shores. Jarl Erik stroked his beard thoughtfully. You speak boldly, Bjorn Frostbeard, but leading such an expedition is no small task. Why should you be the one to lead? Bjorn stood tall, meeting the Jarl's gaze. Because I have the strength to face whatever challenges lie ahead, the wisdom to know when to fight and when to make peace, and the burning desire to see what lies beyond the edge of our maps. I have raided, I have fished, I have worked the land, but always I have felt a calling to something greater. This is that calling, Jarl Erik. I feel it in my bones." A hush fell over the assembly. Even those who had argued against the expedition seemed moved by Bjorn's words. Jarl Erik looked around at his people, gauging their reactions. "Very well," he said at last. "Bjorn Frostbeard, I charge you with leading this expedition. You may choose a crew and take 2 ships, but know this: the fate of our people may rest on your shoulders. Do you accept this responsibility?" Bjorn felt the weight of the moment, the eyes of his entire community upon him. He took a deep breath, then spoke with all the conviction he could muster. "I do, Jarl Erik. I swear by the gods, old and new, that I will not fail our people. We will find this new land, and we will forge a future there that will be sung about for generations to come." A cheer went up from many in the crowd. Even some who had been skeptical now looked at Bjorn with newfound respect. As the thing broke up and people began to disperse, already buzzing with plans and preparations, Bjorn felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Astrid, her eyes gleaming with an inner fire. "The die is cast, Bjorn Frostbeard. You have set your feet upon the path of destiny. Remember my words. Great glory and great peril lie ahead. May the gods grant you the wisdom to navigate between them." As Astrid walked away, Bjorn stood alone for a moment, the weight of his new responsibility settling over him. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with danger and promise in equal measure. But as he looked out over the fjord, towards the distant horizon that had always called to him, Bjorn Frostbeard felt ready to meet whatever challenges awaited in the frozen north. The saga of ice and fire, of gods and men, of glory and doom had begun. The salty spray of the sea stung Bjorn's eyes as he stood at the prow of the lead longship, the Wave Dancer. 2 weeks had passed since they'd left the familiar fjords of home, and the world around them had transformed into an alien seascape of steely gray waters and looming icebergs. "Bjorn," a voice called from behind. He turned to see Freya, his second in command, approaching with a concerned look on her weather-beaten face. "The men are growing restless. We've been sailing north for days with no sign of land." Bjorn nodded, his red beard now flecked with ice crystals. "I know, Freya." But Astrid's vision was clear. "We must push on." As if summoned by her name, the Cirrus emerged from below deck, her dark eyes scanning the horizon. "We're close," she murmured. "I can feel it in the air." Before Bjorn could respond, a cry came from the lookout. "Storm ahead! Dark clouds on the horizon!" The crew burst into action, securing loose items and preparing for rough seas. Bjorn bellowed orders, his voice carrying over the rising wind. "Reef the sail! Lash down the cargo! Everyone, prepare for heavy weather!" The storm hit with a fury that seemed to shake the very foundations of Midgard. Towering waves crashed over the gunwales, and wind howled like 1,000 angry spirits. In the second ship, the Sea Wolf, Bjorn could see his brother Ulf struggling at the helm. "Hold fast," Bjorn roared, gripping the side of the ship as another wave threatened to sweep him overboard. "We are Vikings. We do not fear Thor's wrath." For hours, they battled against the elements. Men bailed water frantically, while others fought to keep the ships on course. Astrid stood amidships, her hair whipping wildly around her face as she chanted prayers to the gods. As dawn broke, the storm began to subside, leaving behind a sea littered with debris and exhausted sailors. Bjorn surveyed the damage, relief washing over him as he confirmed both ships had survived. "Freya," he called, "assess the crew. I want to know our losses." She nodded grimly and moved among the men, checking for injuries and taking stock of their supplies. Bjorn turned his attention to the Sea Wolf, which was listing slightly to one side. "Ulf," he shouted across the water, "what's your status?" His brother's voice came back, strained but steady. "We're taking on water, but we'll manage. Lost 2 men overboard in the night." Bjorn closed his eyes for a moment, offering a silent prayer to Ran, goddess of the sea, for the souls of the fallen. When he opened them again, his resolve had hardened. "We press on," he announced to the crew. Our brothers did not die for us to turn back now. As the day wore on, the temperature dropped further. The sea around them began to change, with small chunks of ice appearing more frequently. By midday, they encountered their first true iceberg, a behemoth of blue-white ice that dwarfed their ships. "By the gods," whispered Freya, her eyes wide with awe. "I've never seen anything like it." Bjorn nodded, equally impressed. "This is why we came, Freya, to see wonders our people have only dreamed of." As they navigated through the increasingly treacherous waters, tension among the crew continued to build. That evening, as they gathered for a meager meal of salted fish and hard bread, murmurs of discontent grew louder. Gunnar, a grizzled veteran of many raids, spoke up. "Bjorn, we've followed you into this frozen hell. How much further must we go? Our supplies dwindle, and the sea grows more dangerous by the day." Bjorn stood, addressing the entire crew. "I know you're tired. I know you're afraid. But I ask you to hold on to your courage for a little longer. We are on the brink of discovery. I can feel it." "And what if your feelings are wrong?" challenged another sailor. "What if we're sailing to our doom?" Before Bjorn could respond, Astrid stepped forward, her presence silencing the dissenters. "The gods do not grant visions lightly," she said, her voice carrying a note of steel. "They have shown me our destination, and it lies ahead, not behind. To turn back now would be to spurn their favor." Her words seemed to calm the crew, but Bjorn knew their resolve was fragile. They needed to find land soon, or mutiny would become a real possibility. As if in answer to his unspoken prayer, the lookout's cry split the air just before dawn the next day. "Land ho! Land to the north!" Excitement rippled through the crew as men rushed to the sides of the ships, straining to catch a glimpse of their destination. Through the early morning mist, a dark line appeared on the horizon, the unmistakable silhouette of a coastline. Bjorn felt a surge of triumph. "You see?" he called out to the crew. "The gods favor us. We have found the land of Astrid's vision." But as they drew closer, their elation turned to dismay. A massive sheet of ice stretched out from the shore, creating an impenetrable barrier between their ships and the land beyond. "What now, Bjorn?" Ulf called from the Sea Wolf. "We can't break through that ice, and we don't have supplies to wait for it to melt." Bjorn's mind raced, considering their options. They were so close, he could not accept failure now. Then, an idea struck him. "We go over it," he announced. "We'll take a small party across the ice on foot. The ships will shelter in that cove to the east, protected from drift ice." Murmurs of disbelief ran through the crew. Freya stepped forward, concern etched on her face. "Bjorn, that's madness. The ice could be unstable, and we don't know what dangers await on the other side." "Which is precisely why I'll lead the party myself," Bjorn replied firmly. "I won't ask any man to take a risk I'm not willing to face." Despite further protests, Bjorn's decision was final. As the ships carefully maneuvered into the sheltered cove, he selected his team: himself, Astrid, Freya, and two of their strongest warriors, Eric and Leif. They prepared quickly, gathering supplies, weapons, and warm furs. As they made ready to disembark, Ulf approached his brother. "This is foolishness, Bjorn," he said, his voice low. "Let me come with you at least." Bjorn clasped his brother's shoulder. "No, Ulf. I need you here, leading the others. If we don't return in 5 days, take the ships and head home. Our people must know what we've found, even if we don't survive to see it." Ulf nodded reluctantly, embracing Bjorn fiercely. "May Thor guard your steps, brother." With final farewells said, Bjorn led his small party onto the ice. The surface was treacherous, alternating between slick, glassy patches and areas of rough, broken ice. They moved carefully, testing each step before committing their weight. As they trudged forward, the ships behind them grew smaller, eventually disappearing into the mist. Ahead, the dark line of the coast seemed to taunt them, never growing closer despite their efforts. "We're being watched," Astrid said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. Bjorn scanned their surroundings, seeing nothing but endless white. "What do you mean?" There's nothing out here. Not nothing, Astrid replied, her eyes unfocused. This land has guardians, old spirits. They're curious about us. And wary. Before Bjorn could question her further, a loud crack split the air. The ice beneath their feet shuddered. "Run!" Bjorn shouted, but it was too late. The ice gave way, plunging them into the freezing water below. The cold hit Bjorn like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs. He thrashed in the water, weighed down by his furs and weapons. Through the panic, he saw Freya struggling nearby, while Eric had managed to cling to the edge of the ice. With desperate strength, Bjorn swam to Freya, grabbing her arm and pulling her towards the solid ice. Eric reached out, hauling them both from the water with a grunt of effort. Gasping and shivering, Bjorn looked around frantically. Astrid? Leif? A splash to their left revealed Leif, who had managed to swim to another section of stable ice. But Astrid was nowhere to be seen. "There!" Freya cried, pointing to a dark shape moving under the translucent ice. Without hesitation, Bjorn grabbed his axe and began smashing at the ice, ignoring the pain in his frozen hands. The others joined him, and soon they had created a hole large enough for Astrid to surface. They pulled her from the water, her lips blue and her eyes closed. For a terrifying moment, Bjorn thought they'd lost her. Then she coughed, expelling water from her lungs, and her eyes fluttered open. "The spirits," she gasped. "They tested us. We passed." Bjorn wasn't sure if it was the cold or fear that sent a shiver down his spine. "Let's get to shore," he said, helping Astrid to her feet. "We need to get warm and dry before we freeze to death." As they resumed their treacherous journey across the ice, Bjorn's mind raced. They had nearly died and they hadn't even reached the shore yet. What other challenges awaited them in this frozen land? And what did Astrid mean about spirits testing them? One thing was certain. Their real trial was only beginning. The land ahead held secrets, dangers, and perhaps the destiny Bjorn had always felt calling to him. As they stumbled forward, exhausted and freezing but alive, Bjorn silently renewed his vow. He would lead his people to a new future, no matter the cost. The shore loomed closer, promising shelter and new discoveries. But as they approached, Bjorn couldn't shake the feeling that unseen eyes were watching their every move, judging their worthiness to set foot in this ancient, frozen realm. The wind howled across the barren landscape, driving needles of ice into any exposed skin. Bjorn Frostbeard, true to his name, felt his beard crackling with frost as he led his small party across the rocky shore. They had made it off the treacherous ice sheet, but the ordeal had left them exhausted and dangerously cold. "We need shelter," Freya shouted over the wind, her teeth chattering. "And soon or we'll freeze to death." Bjorn nodded grimly, scanning the desolate coastline. In the distance, he spotted a dark opening in a cliff face. "There," he called out, pointing. "A cave. It's our best chance." They stumbled towards the cave, half dragging Astrid, who was still weak from her near drowning. As they approached, Leif suddenly grabbed Bjorn's arm. "Wait," he hissed, eyes wide. "Look there by the entrance." Bjorn squinted through the swirling snow. At first he saw nothing, but then a massive shape detached itself from the rocks. It was a bear, but unlike any he had ever seen. This beast was enormous, with fur as white as the snow around it. "By Thor's hammer," Eric whispered. "What manner of creature is that?" Astrid's voice came weak but clear. "A spirit of this land. A guardian." The bear rose on its hind legs, towering over them. It let out a roar that seemed to shake the very ground, a challenge that needed no translation. Bjorn stepped forward, drawing his axe. "I'll distract it. The rest of you get to the cave." "No," Freya protested. "You can't face that monster alone." But Bjorn was already moving, shouting and waving his arms to draw the bear's attention. The massive creature dropped to all fours and charged. Time seemed to slow as Bjorn watched the bear approach. He could see every detail. The steam from its breath, the muscles rippling under its thick fur, the intelligence in its black eyes. In that moment, Bjorn understood that this was no mere animal. This was a test, a challenge from the land itself. As the bear reached him, Bjorn dove to the side, rolling through the snow. He came up swinging, his axe biting into the bear's flank. The creature roared in pain and fury, turning with surprising speed. Bjorn danced back, keeping just out of reach of the massive paws that could easily crush his skull. He feinted left, then struck right, opening another gash in the bear's side. But the fight was far from over. The bear, enraged and wounded, redoubled its assault. A massive paw caught Bjorn's shoulder, sending him sprawling. He tasted blood in his mouth as he scrambled to his feet, barely avoiding the bear's snapping jaws. Just as it seemed the tide was turning against him, a war cry split the air. Freya charged in, her spear flashing in the dim light. She drove it deep into the bear's haunch, giving Bjorn the opening he needed. With a roar of his own, Bjorn buried his axe in the bear's skull. The massive creature swayed for a moment, then collapsed, shaking the ground with its fall. Panting heavily, Bjorn turned to Freya. "I thought I told you to get to the cave." She grinned, despite the blood trickling from a cut on her forehead. "And let you have all the glory? Not a chance." Their moment of triumph was short-lived as the bitter cold reasserted itself. They quickly butchered what meat they could from the bear, knowing its fur and flesh might mean the difference between life and death. Inside the cave, they found signs that others had used it for shelter before, old fire pits and scattered bones. As Eric and Leif worked to start a fire, Bjorn checked on Astrid. The seeress was pale, her lips tinged blue, but her eyes were clear and focused. "You passed the test," she said softly. Bjorn frowned. "What do you mean?" "The bear," Astrid explained. "It was a guardian of this land. By defeating it, you've proven our worth to be here." Bjorn wasn't sure he believed in such mystical explanations, but he couldn't deny the strange feeling that had come over him during the fight. He nodded slowly. "Let's hope it's the last test we face for a while." As the fire blazed to life, they huddled around it, warming their frozen limbs and drying their sodden clothes. The bear meat, though tough, filled their bellies and restored some of their strength. "What now?" Leif asked as night fell outside the cave. "We're here, but we're cut off from the ships. We can't survive long with what little we have." Bjorn stared into the fire, considering their options. "We need to explore, find out what this land has to offer. There must be game, fresh water, maybe even people." Freya looked skeptical. "People? In this frozen wasteland? Why not?" Bjorn countered. "If we can survive here, others might have found a way as well." As if in answer to his words, a strange sound echoed from deeper in the cave. Everyone froze, hands moving to weapons. "What was that?" Eric whispered. The sound came again, a low, rhythmic thumping like a drum. Astrid's eyes widened. "It's them," she breathed. "The people of this land, they're coming." Bjorn stood, axe in hand. "Everyone, be ready. But don't attack unless I give the word. We don't know if they're friendly or hostile." The drumming grew louder, and with it came the sound of voices chanting in a language none of them recognized. Shadows flickered on the cave walls, cast by approaching torches. Then, they appeared. A group of people, dressed in thick furs, their faces painted with intricate designs. They carried spears tipped with bone and stone, but they held them low, not in a threatening posture. At the front of the group was a woman, her face lined with age but her eyes sharp and alert. She stepped forward, regarding Bjorn and his companions with open curiosity. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the woman raised her hand in what seemed to be a gesture of peace. She spoke, her words unintelligible but her tone questioning. Bjorn lowered his axe slowly and stepped forward to meet her. He placed his hand on his chest. "Bjorn," he said clearly, then gestured to his companions, naming each of them in turn. The woman nodded, a hint of a smile touching her lips. She mimicked his gesture, placing her hand on her chest. "Anna," she said. Astrid moved to Bjorn's side, her eyes alight with excitement. "They're the Inuit," she whispered. "The people I saw in my vision. They can help us survive here." Bjorn nodded slightly, never taking his eyes off Anna. He pointed to the bear meat by the fire, then held out his hands, palms up, in an offer to share. Anna's smile widened. She turned and spoke rapidly to her people. Two of them came forward carrying bundles wrapped in sealskin. They laid them at Bjorn's feet and unwrapped them, revealing strange tools, strips of dried meat, and small carvings made of bone and ivory. "A trade," Freya murmured. "They're offering to trade with us." As the two groups cautiously began to mingle, examining each other's offerings, Bjorn felt a surge of hope. They had found not just a new land, but a new people, potential allies in this harsh world. Anna approached Bjorn again, this time accompanied by a man whose elaborate headdress marked him as someone of importance. The man studied Bjorn intently, then spoke to Anna. She nodded and turned to Bjorn, pointing first to him, then to the cave entrance, and finally to a point in the distance. Astrid, who had been watching closely, interpreted. I think they're inviting us to their village." Bjorn considered for a moment. It could be a trap, but his instincts told him otherwise. These people could have easily overwhelmed them if they wanted to. Instead, they had offered trade and now, apparently, hospitality. He nodded to Anna, smiling. "Yes," he said, knowing she wouldn't understand the word, but hoping his tone would convey his acceptance. "We will come with you." As they prepared to leave the cave, gathering what little they had, Bjorn pulled his companions aside. "Remember," he said quietly, "we're not conquerors here. We're guests, and we need their help to survive. Watch, learn, and above all, show respect." They nodded solemnly, understanding the gravity of the situation. As they stepped out of the cave into the frigid night air, Bjorn looked up at the star-filled sky. The constellations were different here, unfamiliar patterns that spoke of how far they had come. Yet as he watched, a streak of green light danced across the heavens, an aurora, just like the ones they saw at home. In that moment, Bjorn felt a profound sense of connection. This land, as harsh and alien as it seemed, was not so different from their own, and its people, strange as they might appear, were not so unlike themselves. With renewed determination, Bjorn followed Anna and her people into the unknown. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he was certain of one thing: their true adventure was only just beginning. The trek to the Inuit village was arduous, each step a battle against the biting wind and treacherous terrain. Bjorn and his companions struggled to keep pace with their guides, who moved across the frozen landscape with practiced ease. As they crested a snow-covered hill, a collection of domed structures came into view, smoke rising from holes in their tops. "By the gods!" Freya breathed, her voice barely audible over the wind. "They live in houses made of snow." Astrid nodded, her eyes wide with wonder. "Igloos. I've heard tales of such dwellings, but never thought to see them with my own eyes." As they approached the village, figures emerged from the igloos, gathering to watch the strangers' arrival. Children peeked out from behind their mothers' legs, while men gripped spears tightly, their faces a mix of curiosity and wariness. Anna raised her hand, calling out to her people in their unfamiliar tongue. The tension in the air eased slightly, but Bjorn could still feel the weight of suspicious gazes upon them. A tall, broad-shouldered man stepped forward, his face lined with age and decorated with intricate tattoos. He spoke to Anna, his tone questioning and sharp. Bjorn watched the exchange intently, wishing he could understand their words. He turned to Astrid, hoping her mystical insights might offer some clarity. "What do you think they're saying?" he asked in a low voice. Astrid's brow furrowed in concentration. "I can't understand the words, but I sense conflict. The man, I believe he's their leader. He's not happy about our presence." Bjorn nodded grimly. He'd expected as much. Strangers were rarely welcomed with open arms, especially in such a harsh land where resources were scarce. The discussion between Anna and the leader grew heated, Suddenly, the man's hand went to the bone knife at his belt, his posture becoming threatening. In an instant, Bjorn stepped forward, placing himself between Anna and the angry leader. He held up his empty hands, palms out, in a universal gesture of peace. "We mean you no harm," Bjorn said, knowing they couldn't understand his words but hoping his tone would convey his meaning. "We are travelers, seeking shelter and knowledge." The Inuit leader's eyes narrowed as he studied Bjorn. For a tense moment it seemed violence might erupt. Then slowly the man's hand moved away from his weapon. Anna spoke again, her voice calm but firm. She gestured to Bjorn and his companions, then to the igloos, clearly advocating for their acceptance. After what felt like an eternity, the leader gave a curt nod. He spoke a few words to Anna, then turned and walked away, the crowd parting to let him pass. Anna turned to Bjorn, a small smile on her weathered face. She motioned for them to follow her. As they moved through the village, Bjorn marveled at the ingenuity of the Inuit. Despite the harsh conditions, they had created a thriving community. He saw women scraping sealskins, men carving tools from bone and ivory, and children playing games with small stones and animal figures. Anna led them to a large igloo near the center of the village. Inside, the temperature was noticeably warmer and the air smelled of smoke and rendered fat. A fire burned in a stone pit, over which hung a pot of something that made Bjorn's stomach growl with hunger. An elderly man sat near the fire, his unseeing eyes milky with cataracts. When they entered, he turned his head towards them, nostrils flaring as if scenting the air. Anna spoke to the old man, who nodded slowly. He then addressed Bjorn and his companions in their own tongue, much to their shock. "Welcome, strangers from across the sea," the old man said, his Norse heavily accented but understandable. "I am Malik, shaman of this tribe. Anna tells me you come seeking knowledge and shelter." Bjorn stepped forward, bowing slightly in respect. "You speak our language. How is this possible?" Malik's blind eyes seemed to look right through Bjorn. "In my youth I traveled far. I have met your people before, though never so far north. The spirits have whispered of your coming." Astrid moved to Bjorn's side, her eyes alight with excitement. "You commune with the spirits as well? I am Astrid, seeress of our people. I had visions that led us here." Malik nodded sagely. "The spirit world knows no boundaries of land or sea. But tell me, why have you come to our frozen shores? Surely not for conquest. You are too few and ill-equipped for our harsh land." Bjorn took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "We come seeking a new home. Our lands to the south grow crowded and resources become scarce. We hope to find new territories to settle, new opportunities for our people." A heavy silence fell over the igloo. Malik's expression was unreadable, but Bjorn could sense the tension in Anna's posture. Finally, Malik spoke. "And what of our people? This land is harsh, but it is ours. We have lived here for countless generations in balance with the spirits and the beasts. What right have you to claim it?" Bjorn felt the weight of the moment. His answer could determine not just their immediate fate, but the future of relations between their peoples. "We do not come to conquer or displace," Bjorn said firmly. "We seek to learn, to adapt. Our people are skilled warriors and craftsmen. Perhaps there is a way we can coexist, even help each other thrive in this unforgiving land." Malik stroked his chin thoughtfully. "Pretty words, but words are wind, easily spoken and just as easily forgotten. How can we trust that your intentions are true?" Before Bjorn could respond, a commotion outside the igloo drew their attention. Shouts of alarm rang out, followed by the unmistakable roar of a bear. Without hesitation, Bjorn rushed outside, his companions close behind. The scene that greeted them was chaos. A massive polar bear, even larger than the one they had fought earlier, had entered the village. It stood on its hind legs, towering over the terrified villagers. Bjorn's hand went to his axe, but he realized with a sinking feeling that they had left their weapons at the edge of the village. a sign of trust that now left them vulnerable. The bear swiped at a group of fleeing children, its massive paw missing them by inches. In that moment, Bjorn made a decision that would change everything. He charged forward, shouting at the top of his lungs to draw the bear's attention. "Hey, over here, you overgrown snow rat!" The bear turned, its black eyes focusing on Bjorn. It dropped to all fours and charged. Bjorn's mind raced, searching for a strategy. His eyes fell on a seal spear leaning against a nearby igloo. In one fluid motion, he snatched it up and braced himself for impact. The bear crashed into him with the force of a battering ram. Bjorn felt ribs crack as he was thrown backward, but he managed to drive the spear deep into the bear's shoulder. The beast roared in pain and fury, rearing up again. Bjorn scrambled to his feet, ignoring the stabbing pain in his side. He circled the bear, looking for another opening. Suddenly, a volley of spears rained down on the bear from all sides. The Inuit hunters had rallied, surrounding the intruder. Bjorn saw Freya and Eric among them, having retrieved their own weapons. The bear, realizing it was outmatched, turned to flee. But Bjorn knew they couldn't let it escape to potentially return later. With a war cry that would have made his ancestors proud, he charged once more. The bear turned to meet him, jaws open wide. At the last moment, Bjorn dropped and slid on the ice, driving his spear up into the bear's throat. Hot blood sprayed across the snow as the massive creature collapsed. Its final roar turned into a gurgle, and then it was still. For a moment, silence reigned. Then cheers erupted from the Inuit. Bjorn found himself surrounded by slaps on the back and words of praise he couldn't understand. Anna approached, her eyes shining with newfound respect. She spoke rapidly to Malik, who had emerged from his igloo. The old shaman nodded, a smile creasing his weathered face. "It seems," he said in Norse, "that you have proven your worth not with words, but with deeds. You risked your life to protect our children. Such an act cannot be ignored." Bjorn, still panting and clutching his injured side, managed a nod. "We meant what we said. We come as friends, not conquerors." Malik turned to address his people in their own language. When he finished, Anna stepped forward and clasped Bjorn's arm in a warrior's grip. "She says," Malik translated, "that you and your people are welcome here. We will teach you our ways, how to survive in this land. In return, we ask that you share your knowledge and skills with us." Bjorn felt a wave of relief and triumph wash over him. They had done it. They had found not just a new land, but new allies. As the Inuit began the process of butchering the fallen bear, Bjorn turned to his companions. "We have much to learn," he said, wincing as Astrid examined his injured ribs. "And much to teach. This is just the beginning." Freya nodded, her eyes scanning the village with new appreciation. "It won't be easy. Our ways are very different." "True," Bjorn agreed. "But that's what makes it an adventure. Together we'll forge a new future, for both our peoples." As the northern lights began to dance across the sky, Bjorn looked out over the icy expanse that would be their new home. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges he could scarcely imagine. But for the first time since they'd set sail from their homeland, he felt truly hopeful. The saga of the frozen north had only just begun. The days following the polar bear attack blended into weeks as Bjorn and his companions integrated into the Inuit village. The initial wariness had given way to a cautious acceptance, though cultural misunderstandings still sparked occasional tensions. One crisp morning, as the sun barely peeked over the horizon, Bjorn emerged from the igloo he now shared with Freya and Eric. His ribs, though still tender, had mostly healed thanks to Inuit herbal remedies and Astrid's ministrations. He found Anna waiting for him, her weathered face creased with concern. "Anna? What's wrong?" The Inuit woman pointed to the sky, where dark clouds loomed ominously. She spoke rapidly in her native tongue, gesturing urgently. Malik, who had taken to acting as translator, hobbled over on his gnarled walking stick. "She says a great storm approaches, one unlike any she has seen in her lifetime. We must prepare." Bjorn nodded grimly. He had learned to trust the Inuits' weather predictions, honed by generations of survival in this harsh land. What do we need to do? As Malik translated Anna's instructions, the village burst into action. Hunters rushed to secure additional food, women reinforced the igloos, and children were tasked with gathering every scrap of firewood they could find. Bjorn turned to Eric, who had joined them. Gather our people. We'll need every hand. As the day progressed, the sky darkened prematurely, and an eerie stillness settled over the land. Bjorn helped the Inuit men construct wind barriers from blocks of hard-packed snow, his muscles straining with the effort. Freya approached, her breath visible in the rapidly cooling air. Bjorn, Astrid wants to see you. She says it's urgent. He found the seeress in Malik's igloo, her eyes unfocused and her body trembling slightly. The old shaman sat across from her, burning herbs that filled the air with pungent smoke. Astrid, what is it? Bjorn asked, kneeling beside her. She turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper. I've had a vision, Bjorn. This storm, it's not natural. I saw great giants of frost and ice stirring in their slumber. Malik nodded solemnly. The spirits are restless. They speak of ancient powers awakening. Bjorn frowned, torn between skepticism and the nagging feeling that there was more to this land than met the eye. Giants? You mean like the Jotnar from our legends? Yes, Astrid said, her voice stronger now. But not just our legends. Malik has shown me. The Inuit have their own stories of ice giants, creatures of immense power that sleep beneath the glaciers. Before Bjorn could respond, a bone-chilling howl cut through the air, drowning out even the rising wind. It was unlike anything he had ever heard. Not animal, not human, but something other. He rushed outside, Astrid and Malik close behind. The storm had arrived with a vengeance, wind whipping snow into a blinding frenzy. But through the whiteout, Bjorn could make out massive, shadowy shapes moving in the distance. By Thor's hammer, he breathed. What are those? Anna appeared at his side, her eyes wide with fear. She spoke rapidly to Malik, who translated. She says they are the Turngeist, evil spirits that bring sickness and death, but she has never seen them take physical form before. As if in response to her words, one of the shapes turned towards the village. 2 points of icy blue light blazed to life. Eyes, Bjorn realized with a shudder. Eyes the size of shield bosses, filled with ancient malevolence. Everyone into the igloos, Bjorn shouted, his voice nearly lost in the howling wind. Now! As the villagers scrambled for shelter, Bjorn grabbed Eric and Freya. We need weapons. Anything we can use to defend ourselves if those things get closer. They rushed to retrieve their axes and swords, but Bjorn couldn't shake the feeling that steel would be of little use against such creatures. Inside Malik's igloo, Astrid and the old shaman were deep in conversation, their words a mix of Norse and Inuktitut. Bjorn caught fragments. Ancient magics, the veil between worlds, balance disturbed. What are they talking about? Freya asked, her knuckles white as she gripped her sword. Bjorn shook his head. I'm not sure, but I think... His words were cut off as the ground beneath them shuddered. Outside, the unearthly howling grew louder, accompanied now by the sound of cracking ice. We can't just hide, Bjorn said, moving towards the entrance. We need to see what we're dealing with. Despite protests from the others, he pushed aside the hide covering the igloo's entrance and stepped out into the maelstrom. The wind nearly knocked him off his feet, but he planted his legs wide and squinted through the swirling snow. What he saw made his blood run cold. Towering figures, easily 5 times the height of a man, were emerging from the ice sheet that bordered the village. Their bodies seemed to be made of living ice, jagged and translucent, with limbs that ended in wickedly sharp points. As Bjorn watched, one of the creatures swung its arm, shattering an empty igloo as if it were made of brittle clay. Jotnar, Bjorn whispered. the legends of his childhood suddenly, terrifyingly real. He felt a presence beside him and turned to see Anna, her face set in grim determination. She held out a spear to him, not the usual hunting spear, but something different. Its shaft was intricately carved with symbols Bjorn didn't recognize, and its tip gleamed with an odd bluish light. Malek's voice came from behind them. An ancient weapon, passed down through generations of our shamans. It is said to have the power to bind spirits. Bjorn took the spear, feeling a strange warmth spread through his arm as he gripped it. How do I use it? But before Malik could answer, one of the ice giants turned its baleful gaze directly on them. With a roar that shook the very ground, it began to advance on the village. "Bjorn!" Freya shouted. "We need to evacuate the village. Those things will destroy everything." He nodded, his mind racing. "Freya, Eric, get everyone to the caves we found last week. They should provide some shelter." He turned to Anna. "Can you lead them?" The Inuit woman nodded, understanding his intent even without translation. She barked orders to her people, who began to stream out of the igloos, carrying what supplies they could. "What about you?" Eric asked, even as he began herding people toward safety. Bjorn hefted the spirit spear. "I'm going to buy you some time." "You can't face those monsters alone," Freya protested. "He won't be alone," Astrid said, emerging from the igloo with Malek. Both carried small pouches and were adorned with strange symbols painted on their faces. "We will use the old magics to aid him." Bjorn wanted to argue, to tell them all to flee to safety, but he knew there was no time. The ice giants were almost upon them, their massive feet leaving craters in the frozen ground with each step. "Go!" he shouted to Freya and Eric. "Get everyone to safety. We'll hold them off as long as we can." As his friends reluctantly retreated with the villagers, Bjorn turned to face the oncoming threat. Astrid and Malek began to chant, their voices somehow carrying over the howling wind. The symbols on their faces began to glow with an eerie light. Bjorn felt power coursing through the spear in his hands. He planted his feet, raised the weapon, and let out a battle cry that would have made his Viking ancestors proud. The nearest ice giant swung its massive arm at him. Bjorn dove and rolled, coming up to thrust the spear into the creature's leg. To his amazement, the bluish tip sank deep into the living ice. The giant roared in pain and fury. But Bjorn's victory was short-lived. Another giant was already upon him, its icy claws slashing the air where his head had been a moment before. He scrambled backward, narrowly avoiding being crushed underfoot. Astrid's voice rose to a fever pitch, and suddenly the air was filled with ghostly flames that swirled around the giants, causing them to recoil. Malek threw handfuls of some powdery substance that exploded into blinding flashes where it touched the creature's icy skin. For a moment it seemed they might actually have a chance. But then more giants emerged from the ice sheet, their glowing eyes fixed on the village with malevolent purpose. As Bjorn raised the spirit spear for another attack, he caught sight of a massive shape in the distance, dwarfing even the giants. It was vaguely humanoid, but made entirely of ice and snow, its head brushing the storm clouds above. With a sinking feeling, Bjorn realized the truth. This wasn't just a freak storm or a random attack. This was an invasion from Jotunheim itself, the realm of the frost giants. And they were hopelessly, laughably outmatched. But as he looked back at the retreating villagers, his people and the Inuit alike, Bjorn knew he couldn't give up. Even if it meant his death, he would buy them every second he could. With a prayer to Thor on his lips, Bjorn Frostbeard charged once more into battle, the fate of two worlds hanging in the balance. The battle raged on, a desperate struggle against forces that seemed beyond mortal comprehension. Bjorn's muscles burned with exertion, his lungs raw from the frigid air as he ducked and weaved between the massive legs of the frost giants. The spirit spear in his hands pulsed with an otherworldly energy, leaving trails of blue light in the air as he struck at the icy behemoths. Astrid and Malek continued their arcane assault, their combined shamanic powers manifesting as swirling vortexes of spectral flame and blinding flashes of light. But for every giant they managed to drive back, two more seemed to emerge from the howling blizzard. "We can't keep this up," Bjorn shouted over the din of battle. "There's too many of them." Astrid's reply was nearly lost in the wind. "We don't need to defeat them all. We just need to—" Her words were cut off as a massive icy fist smashed into the ground beside her, sending her sprawling. Bjorn's heart leapt into his throat. "Astrid!" He rushed to her side, using the spirit spear to vault over a tangle of jagged ice. To his relief, he found her already struggling to her feet, bloodied but alive. "I'm fine," she gasped, clutching her side. "But Bjorn, listen. Malik and I have realized something. These giants, they're not acting on their own. They're being controlled." Bjorn frowned, deflecting a shard of ice with the flat of his axe. "Controlled? By what?" Malik hobbled over to them, his face etched with grim determination. "The Great One," he said, pointing towards the colossal figure Bjorn had spotted earlier. "The king of the ice giants. It is he who has torn open the veil between worlds." As if in response to Malik's words, the towering figure in the distance let out a roar that shook the very foundations of the earth. The smaller giants seemed to move with renewed purpose, pressing their attack on the village with increased ferocity. "If we can stop the king," Astrid said, her eyes blazing with intensity, "we might be able to send them all back to Jotunheim." Bjorn looked between the two shamans, then out at the devastation being wrought upon the land he had come to call home. He made his decision in an instant. "Then that's what we'll do," he said, gripping the spirit spear tightly. "But how do we reach it? It's too far, and these smaller giants are everywhere." Malik's weathered face creased in a smile that held no mirth. "We have one last trick, young Viking, but it will require great sacrifice." Before Bjorn could ask what he meant, Malik began to chant in a language that seemed to resonate with the very ice beneath their feet. The old shaman's body began to glow with an inner light, growing brighter and brighter until Bjorn had to shield his eyes. When the light faded, Bjorn gasped in awe. Where Malik had stood moments before, there was now a massive bird of prey, its feathers gleaming like freshly fallen snow. Astrid's eyes were wide with wonder. "The great snow eagle," she breathed. "I thought it was just a legend." The eagle, Malik, let out a piercing cry and lowered its head, clearly indicating for them to climb onto its back. "Quickly," Astrid urged, already scrambling up onto the great bird's back. "This form won't last long." Bjorn hesitated for only a moment before following suit, positioning himself behind Astrid with the spirit spear held tightly in one hand. As soon as they were settled, Malik spread his enormous wings and launched into the air with a powerful thrust. The sensation was unlike anything Bjorn had ever experienced. The wind whipped past them as they soared above the battlefield, the chaos below reduced to a dizzying blur of motion and ice. Despite the dire circumstances, Bjorn couldn't help but feel a surge of exhilaration. Their elation was short-lived, however. As they approached the colossal form of the giant king, jagged spears of ice began to hurtle through the air around them. Malik banked and dove with incredible agility, but Bjorn could sense the old shaman's strength waning. "There!" Astrid shouted, pointing towards a glowing spot in the center of the giant king's chest. "That must be its heart, the source of its power." Bjorn saw it too, a pulsing core of blue-white energy, partially visible through the giant's translucent, icy form. He tightened his grip on the spirit spear, knowing they would only get one chance at this. "Malik," he called out, "can you get us close enough?" The eagle let out a determined screech and angled towards the giant's chest. They were so close now that Bjorn could see his own reflection in the creature's icy surface. The giant's massive hand swung towards them, fingers like glaciers threatening to swat them from the sky. "Now, Bjorn!" Astrid cried. With every ounce of strength he possessed, Bjorn hurled the spirit spear directly at the glowing heart. Time seemed to slow as the weapon flew, trailing blue fire through the air. For a heart-stopping moment, Bjorn thought it would miss, but then the spear struck true, plunging deep into the giant's chest. The creature let out a bellow of pain and fury that shook the very heavens. Cracks began to spread across its icy body, light spilling from within. Hold on, Astrid shouted, wrapping her arms tightly around Malik's neck. Bjorn barely had time to secure his grip before the world exploded in a blinding flash of light and a deafening roar. He felt himself falling, tumbling through the air as Malik's form dissolved beneath them. The last thing he saw before losing consciousness was the giant king shattering into a million glittering shards. Bjorn awoke to the sound of waves lapping gently against ice. His entire body ached, and for a moment, he wondered if he had died and gone to Valhalla. But the pain told him he was very much alive. He opened his eyes slowly, blinking against the harsh glare of sunlight on snow. As his vision cleared, he saw Astrid kneeling beside him, her face etched with concern. "Welcome back," she said softly, a relieved smile spreading across her face. "We were starting to worry," Bjorn groaned as he pushed himself into a sitting position. What happened? The giants?" "Gone," Astrid replied. "When you destroyed the king's heart, they all just crumbled. The storm dissipated almost instantly." As Bjorn's mind cleared, he suddenly remembered their other companion. "Malik, is he?" Astrid's expression grew somber. "He's alive, but barely. The transformation took a great toll on him. He's resting in one of the few igloos that survived." Bjorn nodded, a mix of relief and guilt washing over him. He looked around, taking in the devastation left in the wake of the battle. The village was in ruins, with only a handful of structures still standing. In the distance, he could see the villagers emerging from the caves, surveying the damage with shocked expressions. "How many did we lose?" he asked, dreading the answer. Astrid shook her head. "We're still counting, but it could have been much worse. Your actions saved many lives, Bjorn." He wasn't sure if he deserved such praise, but before he could respond, a commotion from the shoreline caught their attention. A group of villagers had gathered, pointing and shouting at something in the water. With Astrid's help, Bjorn got to his feet and made his way to the shore. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. Where there had once been an unbroken expanse of ice stretching to the horizon, there was now open water, and in that water, partially submerged, was an enormous structure of ice and stone. Its architecture was unlike anything Bjorn had ever seen, a fusion of Norse and Inuit styles, but with an otherworldly quality that spoke of its origins in Jotunheim. "By the gods," Bjorn whispered. "What is it?" Anna appeared at his side, her eyes wide with wonder. She spoke rapidly, gesturing towards the structure. "She says it's the heart of winter," Astrid translated. "A legendary place spoken of in Inuit myths. It's said to be a bridge between our world and the realm of spirits and giants." As they watched, a section of the structure rose from the water, revealing an entrance large enough to sail a longship through. The ice around it began to refreeze, creating a pathway to the shore. Freya and Eric joined them, their expressions a mix of awe and trepidation. "What do we do now?" Freya asked. Bjorn looked at the faces around him, Viking and Inuit alike, all waiting for guidance in this strange new reality they found themselves in. He thought of the journey that had brought them here, the hardships they had faced, and the bonds they had forged. Finally he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of decision. "We explore it, together. Whatever lies within that structure, be it knowledge, power, or further dangers, we face it as one people." Anna nodded approvingly, and Bjorn saw respect in the eyes of the Inuit gathered around them. They had proven themselves not just as warriors, but as true allies. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the icy landscape, Bjorn looked out at the mysterious structure that had emerged from the sea. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a much greater adventure, one that would test them in ways they couldn't yet imagine. But as he felt the presence of his companions beside him, both old friends and new allies, Bjorn Frostbeard knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The Frozen Saga was far from over. The days following the emergence of the Heart of Winter were filled with frantic activity. The village worked tirelessly to rebuild what had been destroyed, while small scouting parties cautiously approached the mysterious structure. Bjorn found himself caught between two worlds, helping with reconstruction efforts and planning their exploration of the ice fortress. As the pale sun rose on the fifth day, Bjorn stood at the edge of the newly formed ice bridge, staring at the looming structure. Its walls gleamed with an inner light, pulsing softly like a heartbeat. "It's time," Astrid said, appearing at his side. Her face was drawn with fatigue, but her eyes burned with determination. "Malik's condition is stable. He insists we must enter the heart of winter before the next full moon." Bjorn nodded, his hand unconsciously gripping the hilt of his axe. "Have you seen anything in your visions? Any hint of what we might find in there?" Astrid's brow furrowed. "Only fragments. Great halls of ice, ancient knowledge, and danger. Always danger." "Comforting," Bjorn muttered. He turned to see Anna approaching, followed by a small group of Inuit warriors. The tribe's leader had insisted on joining the expedition, her knowledge of local legends proving invaluable. "Are we ready?" Anna asked through Astrid's translation. Bjorn took a deep breath, surveying their group. Along with himself, Astrid and Anna, they had Freya, Eric, and 3 of the most skilled Inuit hunters. A small party, but hopefully agile enough to navigate whatever challenges lay ahead. "As ready as we'll ever be," Bjorn replied. "Let's move out." They set off across the ice bridge, their footsteps echoing in the eerie stillness. As they drew closer to the entrance, Bjorn could feel a vibration in the air, like the hum of a massive beehive. The entrance loomed before them, a gaping maw of darkness that seemed to swallow the light. Bjorn unsheathed his axe, its familiar weight providing some comfort. "Stay close," he instructed. "We don't know what—" His words were cut short as the ground beneath them shuddered. A low groan emanated from the structure, and suddenly, the darkness within the entrance was replaced by a soft, blue glow. "It's welcoming us?" Eric said, his voice a mix of awe and apprehension. Anna spoke rapidly, her eyes wide. Astrid translated. "She says the old stories speak of the heart of winter choosing those worthy to enter. It seems we've been deemed acceptable." Bjorn squared his shoulders. "Well, let's not keep it waiting." They stepped into the entrance, the blue glow intensifying around them. The air inside was surprisingly warm, a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. As their eyes adjusted, they found themselves in a vast hall, its ceiling lost in shadows high above. Intricate patterns of frost covered the walls, forming images that seemed to shift and change as they walked. "By the gods," Freya breathed. "It's beautiful." Bjorn nodded in agreement, but kept his guard up. Beauty, he knew, often concealed deadly dangers in this unforgiving land. As they ventured deeper into the hall, a sound reached their ears, a rhythmic thumping like a giant's heartbeat. The blue glow pulsed in time with the sound, growing stronger with each beat. Suddenly Astrid gasped, clutching her head. "The voices," she whispered. "So many voices." Before Bjorn could reach her, a blinding flash of light erupted from the center of the hall. When it faded, a figure stood before them. A woman of impossible beauty, her skin as pale as snow, her hair a cascade of icicles. Her eyes, when they met Bjorn's, were ancient and filled with swirling galaxies. "Welcome, seekers," the figure spoke, her voice resonating through their very bones. "I am Skadi, goddess of winter and the hunt. You stand in the heart of my domain." Bjorn fell to one knee, the others quickly following suit. He had heard tales of Skadi since childhood, but never dreamed he would stand in her presence. "Great Skadi," he said, struggling to keep his voice steady. "We come seeking knowledge and aid. Our world faces a threat from Jotunheim." "I know why you have come, Bjorn Frostbeard," Skadi interrupted, a hint of amusement in her voice. "The balance between realms has been disturbed. The Jötnar grow restless, pushing against the boundaries that have contained them for eons." She waved her hand, and the frost patterns on the walls came to life, showing scenes of giants rampaging across frozen landscapes. What you faced was but a small incursion. The true invasion is yet to come. Anna stepped forward, bowing deeply before speaking. Astrid translated, "Great One, our people have lived in harmony with the spirits of this land for countless generations. How can we restore the balance?" Scotty's expression softened slightly. "Your people remember the old ways, child of the North. That wisdom will be crucial in the days to come." She turned her gaze back to Bjorn. "But it must be combined with the strength and determination of the newcomers. Only together do you stand a chance against what is coming." The goddess raised her arms, and the hall transformed around them. They found themselves standing on a vast ice sheet, watching as cracks spread across its surface. From those cracks emerged Jötnar of all shapes and sizes, their eyes gleaming with malevolent purpose. "The great freeze approaches," Scotty's voice echoed around them. "The Jötnar seek to remake this world in their image, to cover it in eternal ice. If they succeed, all you know and love will be lost." The vision shifted, showing the village and surrounding lands buried under mountains of snow and ice. Bjorn's heart clenched at the sight of his people, Inuit and Viking alike, frozen in eternal slumber. "How do we stop it?" Bjorn demanded, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Tell us what we must do." The vision faded, and they were back in the hall. Scotty regarded them with a mixture of sympathy and steel in her eyes. "The task before you is great and the price of failure unthinkable. To stop the great freeze, you must seal the rifts between worlds. But to do so, you will need power beyond that of mere mortals." She gestured, and 3 pedestals rose from the floor, each bearing an object: a gleaming war hammer, a delicate silver crown, and a gnarled wooden staff. "These artifacts contain a portion of my power," Scotty explained. "The hammer of frost, capable of shattering mountains and freezing oceans. The crown of rime, which grants dominion over ice and snow. And the staff of blizzards, with the power to summon and control the fiercest winter storms." Bjorn's eyes widened at the sight of such powerful artifacts, but before he could speak, Scotty continued, her voice grave. "Choose wisely, for each artifact comes with a price. The power they grant may save your world, but it will also change those who wield them, forever." A heavy silence fell over the group as the weight of Scotty's words sank in. Bjorn looked at his companions, seeing the same mix of fear and determination in their eyes that he felt in his own heart. "What of the Jötnar already in our world?" Freya asked. "The ones we fought before?" Scotty's expression darkened. "They are but the vanguard. Even now their king gathers his forces for a full invasion. You have little time to prepare." Bjorn stepped forward, his decision made. "We'll do whatever it takes to protect our people in this land. If wielding these artifacts is the price we must pay, then so be it." Anna spoke, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. Through Astrid's translation, she said, "Our legends speak of such moments when mortals must bear the weight of the gods' power. We accept this burden." Scotty nodded, a glimmer of approval in her cosmic eyes. "Very well. Choose your champions, and choose wisely, for the fate of your world now rests in your hands." As Bjorn approached the pedestals, he felt the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders. The artifacts pulsed with barely contained power, calling to him. He knew that whatever choice they made here would change everything. He turned to his companions, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his heart. "We came to this land seeking a new beginning. Now we find ourselves tasked with saving not just our new home, but the entire world. It won't be easy, and the cost may be higher than we can imagine. But we are Vikings, we are Inuit, we are the children of the North. Together we will face this threat, and together we will triumph." A chorus of agreement met his words. As they stood there in the heart of winter itself, Bjorn Frostbeard knew that their greatest challenge, and their greatest adventure, was only just beginning. The time had come to choose their champions, to wield the power of a goddess, and to stand against the coming storm. The fate of 2 peoples, and indeed the whole world, hung in the balance. But as Bjorn looked at the determined faces of his companions, he felt a surge of hope. Whatever trials lay ahead, they would face them together, The awakening had begun. The heart of winter pulsed with an otherworldly energy as Bjorn, Astrid, and Anna stood before the three artifacts. The weight of their decision hung heavy in the air, each of them acutely aware that their choice would shape the fate of their world. Bjorn reached out, his hand hovering over the hammer of frost. He could feel its power calling to him, resonating with the warrior's spirit that ran deep in his Viking blood. With a deep breath, he grasped the handle. Immediately, a surge of icy energy coursed through his body. Bjorn gasped, his vision filling with swirling patterns of frost and snow. When it cleared, he found his arm encased in intricate gleaming ice armor, the hammer an extension of his very being. Beside him, Anna approached the crown of rime with reverence. As she placed it upon her head, her eyes glowed with an inner light, and the air around her shimmered with tiny ice crystals. Astrid, drawn as if by an invisible force, took up the staff of blizzards. The moment her fingers touched the gnarled wood, wind whipped around her, and her hair turned as white as freshly fallen snow. Scotty's voice echoed through the chamber. "The pact is sealed. Use these gifts wisely, for they are both blessing and curse. Now go, champions of the mortal realm. The Jötnar will not wait long to strike." With a flash of blinding light, they found themselves back at the entrance of the heart of winter. The structure began to sink back into the sea, leaving only the ice bridge as evidence of its existence. Freya and Eric rushed to meet them, their eyes wide with shock at the transformation of their companions. "By the gods," Eric breathed. "What happened in there?" Bjorn opened his mouth to explain, but a bone-chilling roar in the distance cut him off. They turned to see dark storm clouds gathering on the horizon, unnatural in their speed and ferocity. "They're coming," Astrid said, her voice carrying an echo of winter winds. "The Jötnar have begun their invasion." Anna barked orders to the Inuit warriors who sprinted back to the village to prepare defenses. She turned to Bjorn, her eyes glowing with ethereal power. "We must warn the people, evacuate those who cannot fight." Bjorn nodded grimly. "Freya, Eric, go with Anna, coordinate the defenses, and get the vulnerable to safety. Astrid and I will try to slow the Jötnar's advance." As their companions rushed off, Bjorn and Astrid made their way to a high ridge overlooking the approaching storm. The hammer of frost hummed with energy in Bjorn's grip, while the air around Astrid crackled with barely contained power. "Are you ready for this?" Bjorn asked, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. Astrid's lips curved in a grim smile. "Ready or not, the battle is upon us. Let us show these giants the true power of winter." With a nod, Bjorn raised the hammer of frost high. Lightning crackled along its surface as he brought it down with all his might, striking the ground before them. A massive wall of ice erupted from the impact, stretching for miles in either direction and towering hundreds of feet into the air. Astrid raised the staff of blizzards, her eyes glowing white. The wind intensified, becoming a swirling vortex of snow and ice that engulfed the approaching storm clouds. For a moment, it seemed as though they had succeeded in halting the invasion. But then, with a sound like a mountain splitting in two, a massive fist punched through the ice wall. A Jotun, larger than any they had faced before, tore through the barrier as if it were made of parchment. Behind it came an army of frost giants, their eyes gleaming with malevolent purpose. "Fall back," Bjorn shouted. "We need to regroup with the others." They raced back to the village, where they found a scene of frantic preparation. Inuit and Vikings worked side by side, constructing makeshift barricades and arming themselves with whatever weapons they could find. Anna stood at the center of it all, the crown of rime glowing upon her brow. As Bjorn and Astrid approached, they saw her raise her hands, causing a swirling dome of ice and snow to form over the village. "It will not hold them for long," she said, her voice strained with effort. "But it may buy us some time." Freya emerged from one of the intact igloos, her face grim. "The children and elders are hidden in the caves. Everyone else is armed and ready to fight." Bjorn nodded, surveying the determined faces around him. "Listen to me, all of you," he called out, his voice carrying the authority of a born leader. "What comes for us is beyond anything we have faced before. but we are not defenseless. We have been chosen by Skadi herself to wield the power of winter against these invaders. He raised the hammer of frost, its surface crackling with energy. With this hammer I will shatter their armies. Anna's crown will turn their own element against them, and Astrid's staff will blind them with the fury of the storm. A cheer went up from the assembled warriors, but it was quickly drowned out by an earth-shaking roar. The dome of ice above them began to crack as massive fists pounded against it. "But we cannot do this alone," Bjorn continued, his voice rising above the din. "Each of you, Viking and Inuit alike, must fight with everything you have, for if we fall here, the world falls with us." As if in response to his words, the ice dome shattered. Jötnar poured into the village, their massive forms dwarfing the defenders. The battle was joined in earnest, the air filled with war cries and the clash of weapons against icy flesh. Bjorn waded into the fray, the hammer of frost a blur of destructive power. Each swing shattered Jötnar into countless glittering shards, but for every giant that fell, 2 more seemed to take its place. Across the battlefield, Anna stood atop a ruined igloo, the crown of rime blazing with power. She gestured, and massive spikes of ice erupted from the ground, impaling several Jötnar. But the strain of wielding such power was evident on her face, a trickle of blood running from her nose. Astrid hovered above the chaos, carried aloft by howling winds. The staff of blizzards whirled in her hands, sending tornadoes of razor-sharp ice shards tearing through the ranks of frost giants. Yet even her godly powers seemed dwarfed by the sheer number of invaders. As the battle raged on, Bjorn found himself back-to-back with Freya, both of them breathing heavily and covered in a mixture of blood and frost. "There's too many," Freya gasped, parrying a giant's club with her sword. "We can't keep this up forever." Bjorn knew she was right. Despite their divine artifacts and the valor of their warriors, they were being slowly overwhelmed. His eyes scanned the battlefield, searching for some advantage, some way to turn the tide. Then he saw it. In the distance, towering above even the largest Jötnar, was a figure that could only be their king. Its body was like a glacier given life, its eyes twin pools of deepest winter, and in its chest, barely visible through the translucent ice, was a pulsing core of blue-white energy. "The heart," Bjorn breathed, remembering their first encounter with the Jötnar. "If we can destroy the king's heart, maybe we can end this once and for all." But reaching the giant king seemed an impossible task. An army of frost giants stood between them, and even with the power of the hammer of frost, Bjorn knew he couldn't fight through them all. As if sensing his thoughts, Astrid descended from the sky, her white hair whipping in the wind. "Bjorn," she called, her voice carrying an otherworldly resonance. "I've seen a vision. The artifacts, they're meant to be used together." Achna joined them, her face etched with fatigue but her eyes burning with determination. "Yes," she said, the crown of rime pulsing in time with her words. "I can feel it too. Our powers are strongest when united." Bjorn looked between them, a plan forming in his mind. "Then let's give these Jötnar a song of ice they'll never forget." With a nod of understanding, Astrid and Anna placed their hands on the hammer of frost. The moment their artifacts touched, a surge of power unlike anything they had felt before coursed through them. Bjorn raised the hammer high, feeling the combined might of all 3 artifacts flowing through him. He brought it down with a thunderous crash, and the world exploded into blinding white light. When the light faded, a colossal wave of ice and snow was racing towards the Jotun king, carving a path through the lesser giants, as if they were no more than leaves in the wind. The wave took the form of a massive eagle, its wings spanning the entire battlefield, its beak aimed directly at the king's heart. The Jotun king roared in defiance, bringing its fists down to meet the oncoming attack. But the power of 3 artifacts wielded as one was too much even for the monarch of Jotunheim. The ice eagle struck true, its beak piercing the giant's chest and shattering the frozen heart within. For a moment, all was silent. Then, with a sound like 1,000 glaciers calving at once, the Jotun king began to crumble. As their king fell, The remaining frost giants seemed to lose their purpose. Some crumbled to lifeless snow, while others fled back towards the rifts between worlds, which were already beginning to close. Bjorn, Astrid, and Anna collapsed to their knees, the effort of wielding such power leaving them utterly drained. Around them, the surviving defenders began to cheer, the sound growing from a few tired voices to a thunderous roar of triumph. As the sun broke through the dissipating storm clouds, Bjorn looked out over the battered but unbroken village. Viking and Inuit stood side by side, bloodied and exhausted but alive. They had faced the wrath of Jotunheim itself and emerged victorious. But even as relief washed over him, Bjorn couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The rifts between worlds had been closed, but for how long? And what other challenges might arise in this harsh but beautiful land they now called home? As if reading his thoughts, Astrid placed a hand on his shoulder. "The saga is far from over, Bjorn Frostbeard," she said softly. "But whatever comes next, we'll face it together." Bjorn nodded, a tired smile spreading across his face. The Song of Ice had been sung, and they had survived to tell the tale. Whatever the future held, he knew that the bonds forged in this battle, between Viking and Inuit, between mortal and divine, would see them through. The dawn of a new era had begun in the frozen north, and Bjorn Frostbeard was ready to meet it head-on. The weeks following the defeat of the Jotun king were filled with a flurry of activity. The village, battered but unbroken, slowly began to rebuild. Viking and Inuit worked side by side, their shared ordeal forging bonds stronger than blood. But even as life seemed to return to normal, an undercurrent of tension ran through the community. Bjorn stood atop a newly constructed watchtower, his eyes scanning the horizon. The hammer of frost hung at his side, its weight a constant reminder of the power and responsibility he now bore. "Anything?" Freya's voice came from behind him as she climbed the ladder to join him. Bjorn shook his head. "Nothing yet, but they're out there. I can feel it." Freya nodded grimly. The scouts reported more rifts opening to the east, smaller than before, but growing, Bjorn finished. He turned to face his friend, noting the dark circles under her eyes. None of them had been sleeping well lately. "How are the defenses coming?" "As well as can be expected," Freya replied. "Anna's people have been teaching us their ice-building techniques. Combined with our own fortifications, we should be better prepared this time." A commotion from the village center caught their attention. They descended the watchtower quickly to find a group gathering around Astrid and Malik. The old shaman, still weak from his transformation during the first battle, leaned heavily on his staff. "What's going on?" Bjorn asked as he approached. Astrid's face was pale, her white hair whipping in a wind that seemed to affect no one else. "We've had a vision," she said, her voice carrying an otherworldly echo. "The Jötnar. They're not just invading. They're trying to remake our world in their image." Malik nodded solemnly. "The Great Freeze," he rasped. "If they succeed, all lands will be covered in eternal ice. No life as we know it will survive." A murmur of fear ran through the gathered crowd. Bjorn felt the weight of their gazes upon him, looking to him for leadership, for hope. "How long do we have?" he asked. Astrid closed her eyes, concentrating. "Days. Maybe less. They're gathering their strength for one final push." Bjorn's mind raced, considering their options. They had beaten back the Jötnar once, but at great cost. Could they do it again? As if reading his thoughts, Anna stepped forward, the crown of rime glowing softly on her brow. "We are stronger now," she said, her words translated by one of the villagers who had been learning Norse. "United, and we have the gifts of Skadi." Bjorn nodded, drawing strength from her words. "Gather everyone," he commanded. "We need to prepare for the fight of our lives." The next hours were a blur of activity. Weapons were forged and enchanted with runes of frost. Barriers of ice and stone were erected around the village perimeter. Every able-bodied person, Viking and Inuit alike, trained in combat techniques that blended their different fighting styles. As the midnight sun dipped towards the horizon, casting long shadows across the icy landscape, Bjorn called a final meeting of their war council. "The plan is simple," he said, gesturing to a crude map drawn in the snow. "We form 3 lines of defense. The outer ring will be our archers and spear throwers using hit-and-run tactics to thin their numbers. The second ring will engage in close combat, with our best warriors holding the line, and in the center, we 3 will stand," Astrid finished, indicating herself, Bjorn, and Anna. "With the artifacts of Skadi will be the last line of defense." Eric, his face grim, spoke up. "And what if that's not enough? What if we can't hold them back?" A heavy silence fell over the group. It was Freya who finally answered, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "Then we die fighting, as Vikings and hunters should, but we'll take as many of those ice bastards with us as we can." A chorus of agreement met her words. Bjorn looked around at the faces of his companions, friends old and new, united in purpose. Whatever happened, he knew they would face it together. As if on cue, a bone-chilling howl split the air. On the horizon, storm clouds gathered with unnatural speed, flashes of icy blue lightning illuminating massive shapes within. "They're here," Astrid whispered, her grip tightening on the staff of blizzards. Bjorn raised the hammer of frost, its surface crackling with energy. "To your positions," he roared. "For our home, for our future, for the world itself, we fight." The Jotnar came like an avalanche, a tide of ice and malevolence that threatened to overwhelm everything in its path. But the defenders were ready. Arrows tipped with magical ice flew true, each one felling a frost giant. Spears of enchanted bone pierced Jotun hide that normal weapons couldn't penetrate. Bjorn lost himself in the rhythm of battle, the hammer of frost a blur of destructive power. Beside him, Anna wielded the crown of rime with deadly precision, turning the very ground beneath the Jotnar's feet into treacherous, spiked ice. Astrid hovered above, the staff of blizzards whipping up localized storms that tore through the invaders' ranks. But for every giant that fell, 2 more seemed to take its place. The outer defensive ring began to buckle under the relentless assault. "Fall back to the second line," Bjorn shouted, his voice carrying over the din of battle. He watched with a mixture of pride and anguish as his people retreated in good order, buying time with their blood for the others to regroup. Hours seemed to pass in the blink of an eye. The second defensive ring held longer, but eventually it too began to crumble. Bjorn saw friends fall, Eric taking a massive icy club to the chest, Gunnar the smith crushed beneath a giant's foot. Each loss fueled his rage, the hammer of frost glowing brighter with every swing. As the survivors retreated to the village center for a final stand, Bjorn found himself back to back with Freya. Both were breathing heavily, covered in a mixture of blood, sweat, and frost. "Just like old times," Freya gasped, parrying a Jotun's strike with her sword. Bjorn managed a grim chuckle. "Somehow, I don't remember the giants being quite this big in our raids back home." Their banter was cut short as the ground beneath them began to shake. The Jotnar parted, revealing a figure that dwarfed even the largest of their kind. It was a new king, its body a masterpiece of cruel ice architecture, its eyes burning with hateful intelligence. "By the gods," Astrid breathed, landing beside them. "It's him, the architect of the Great Freeze." The Jotun king surveyed the battered defenders with contempt. When it spoke, its voice was like glaciers grinding against each other. "Foolish mortals," it rumbled in perfect Norse. "Your struggle is pointless. This world will be remade in ice and snow, as it was always meant to be." Bjorn stepped forward, the hammer of frost held high. "Not while we still draw breath," he growled. "This is our home and we'll defend it to the last." The king's laughter shook the very ground. "Such spirit, it will be a pleasure to extinguish it." With frightening speed for something so massive, the Jotun king charged. What followed was a battle that would be sung about for generations. Bjorn, Astrid, and Anna fought as one, their artifacts pulsing with divine power. The hammer of frost shattered the king's icy armor. The crown of rime turned its attacks back upon itself, and the staff of blizzards buffeted it with winds strong enough to carve canyons in stone. But the Jotun king was a force of nature unto itself. It regenerated damage almost as quickly as they could inflict it, and each of its blows threatened to annihilate them entirely. The defenders fought valiantly around them, holding off the lesser giants, but Bjorn knew it was only a matter of time before they were overwhelmed. As he dodged another earth-shattering blow, Bjorn's eyes fell upon the king's chest. There, barely visible through the translucent ice, was a pulsing core of energy, the heart of the great freeze itself. "The heart!" he shouted to Astrid and Anna. "We need to destroy it." Anna nodded in understanding. "Together!" she cried, reaching out to grasp the hammer of frost alongside Bjorn. Astrid joined them, adding her grip to the weapon. As before, the moment all three artifacts connected, a surge of power unlike anything they had ever felt coursed through them. The Jotun king, sensing the danger, roared in fury and charged once more. But this time they were ready. With a unified cry that seemed to shake the very foundations of the world, they brought the hammer of frost down. A beam of pure winter energy erupted from the weapon, piercing through the king's defenses and striking its heart. For a moment everything seemed to stand still. Then, with a sound like 1,000 glaciers shattering at once, the Jotun king exploded into 1,000,000 glittering shards. A shockwave of cold energy radiated outward, washing over friends and foes alike. When it passed, every Jotun on the battlefield had been reduced to harmless snow, gently falling to the ground. Silence fell over the battlefield, broken only by the ragged breathing of the survivors. Then, slowly, a cheer began to build. It started with just a few voices, but soon swelled into a roar of triumph that echoed across the frozen landscape. Bjorn, Astrid, and Anna collapsed to their knees, utterly drained. The artifacts of Skadi dimmed, their power spent in that final world-saving blow. As the cheers continued around them, Freya limped over, a tired smile on her blood-streaked face. "We did it," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "We actually did it." Bjorn nodded, too exhausted for words. He looked out over the battlefield, taking in the cost of their victory. So many had fallen, Viking and Inuit alike. But those who remained stood tall, united in a way he had never thought possible. As the midnight sun began to rise once more, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, Bjorn felt a profound sense of change. They had faced the wrath of Jotunheim itself and emerged victorious. The world was safe, at least for now. But more than that, something new had been born here on this frozen shore. A community forged in the fires of battle, blending the strengths of two proud peoples. As he watched Vikings and Inuit embrace, sharing in their relief and grief, Bjorn knew that their real journey was just beginning. The great freeze had been averted, but the challenges of building a new life in this harsh land remained. Yet as Bjorn looked at the faces of his companions, Astrid with her newfound shamanic powers, Achna with her quiet strength, Freya with her unwavering loyalty, he felt a surge of hope. Whatever the future held, they would face it together. The frozen saga had reached its climax, but the story of their people, this new people born of ice and fire, of north and south, was only just beginning. As the first rays of the new day touched his face, Bjorn Frostbeard smiled. The final battle was over. Now, the real work could begin, unity he had been waiting for. Jarl Erik raised his hands for silence. The longship's dragon-headed prow cut through the mist-shrouded waters of the North Sea. Bjorn Ragnarsson stood at the bow, his keen eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of land. The salt-laden air whipped through his braided hair, carrying with it the promise of glory and riches. "Land ho!" The cry came from the crow's nest, sending a ripple of excitement through the crew. Bjorn's hand instinctively tightened on the hilt of his sword, blood drinker. "Ready yourselves, men," Bjorn's voice boomed across the deck. "The coast of Northumbria awaits, ripe for the taking." A chorus of cheers and the clashing of weapons against shields answered him. These were his men, hardened warriors who had followed him on countless raids. They trusted him with their lives, and he would lead them to victory once more. As the shoreline emerged from the mist, Bjorn's heart raced with anticipation. The monastery of Lindisfarne stood silhouetted against the pale morning sky, its stone walls a pitiful defense against the fury of the Northmen. "Oars out," Bjorn commanded. "Let's show these Christian sheep the might of Thor." The longship surged forward, its oars churning the water into a frothy wake. Bjorn could already taste the sweetness of victory on his tongue. Little did he know that fate had other plans for him this day. The beach erupted into chaos as the Vikings poured from their ships. Bjorn led the charge, blood drinker singing its deadly song as it cleaved through the air. The few Saxon defenders on the beach were no match for the battle-hardened Norsemen. "To the monastery!" Bjorn roared, pointing with his bloodied sword. "Let no one stand in our way." As they stormed up the hill towards the stone buildings, bells began to toll frantically. Monks in brown robes scattered like frightened rabbits, some clutching precious manuscripts to their chests. Bjorn kicked down the door of the main hall, wood splintering under his boot. Inside, a group of monks huddled around something, their backs to the entrance. "Step aside, and you may yet live to see another dawn," Bjorn growled, advancing into the room. One of the monks turned, revealing not fear, but fierce determination in his eyes. In his hands, he clutched an ornate cross of gold and precious gems. "You'll not take this, heathen," the monk spat. "God protects his own." Bjorn laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the stone walls. "Your God is far from here, old man. Now give me that trinket and I might let you keep your hands." The monk's response was swift and unexpected. He swung the heavy cross like a mace, catching Bjorn off guard. The Viking warrior stumbled back, more surprised than hurt. "You dare?" Bjorn snarled, his vision turning red with rage. He lunged forward, blood drinker flashing in the dim light. But the monk was quicker than he looked. He ducked under Bjorn's swing and thrust the pointed base of the cross upward with all his might. Pain exploded in Bjorn's face as the cross connected with his left eye. He roared in agony, staggering backward. Blood poured down his cheek and the world tilted sickeningly. Bjorn, one of his men, Ulf, rushed to his side. "By the gods, your eye." Through the haze of pain, Bjorn could see the monk backing away, horror written across his face. The cross, now stained with blood, clattered to the floor. "Kill them all," Bjorn growled, his voice thick with pain and fury. He pressed a hand to his ruined eye, feeling warm blood seep between his fingers. The room erupted into violence once more. Bjorn leaned heavily against a pillar, his good eye struggling to focus. The sounds of screams and clashing metal filled the air, but they seemed distant, muffled. "Bjorn, we need to get you back to the ship," Ulf said, his voice cutting through the fog. "That eye needs tending." Bjorn nodded numbly, allowing his friend to lead him out of the monastery. The raid continued around them, but Bjorn was oblivious to it all. His world had narrowed to a pinpoint of agony centered on his face. The journey back to Norway was a blur of pain and fever. Bjorn drifted in and out of consciousness, plagued by nightmares of darkness closing in around him. When he finally came to his senses, he found himself in his own bed, the familiar sense of home surrounding him. "He wakes," a gruff voice said. Bjorn turned his head to see his father, Ragnar the Red, sitting by his bedside. The old warrior's face was etched with concern. "Father?" Bjorn croaked, his throat dry. "How long?" 2 weeks, Ragnar replied, offering a cup of water. "We feared we'd lost you to fever." Bjorn drank greedily, then reached up to touch his face. Thick bandages covered his left eye. "Your eye," Ragnar began, then trailed off. "Tell me," Bjorn demanded. His father sighed heavily. "The healers did what they could, but the damage was too great. You'll not see from that eye again." The words hit Bjorn like a physical blow. He lay back, staring at the ceiling with his remaining eye. A warrior with one eye was a liability, a burden. He might as well be dead. "Leave me," he whispered. "Son." "Leave," Bjorn roared, turning away from his father. He heard Ragnar's heavy footsteps retreat, followed by the soft closing of the door. Only then did Bjorn allow the tears to come, hot and bitter, soaking into his bandages. Days passed, blending into weeks. Bjorn refused all visitors, even as he heard the whispers outside his door. The great Bjorn Ragnarsson, felled by a monk's cross. How the mighty had fallen. One night, as the full moon hung low in the sky, Bjorn made his decision. He rose from his bed, donning his armor with practiced ease despite his impaired depth perception. Blooddrinker hung at his side, a familiar weight that brought him no comfort. He slipped out of the longhouse, making his way down to the fjord. The night was clear and cold, stars twinkling overhead like the jewels he'd never raid again. Bjorn stood at the water's edge, looking out over the dark expanse. "So, this is how it ends," he murmured, drawing Blooddrinker from its sheath. The blade gleamed in the moonlight, as thirsty as ever. "One last taste, old friend." He raised the sword, preparing to fall upon it. Better a warrior's death than a life of shame and pity. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Bjorn Ragnarsson." The voice, soft yet commanding, startled him. Bjorn whirled around, nearly losing his balance. A figure stood in the shadows of a nearby pine, cloaked and hooded. "Who goes there?" Bjorn demanded, brandishing his sword. "Show yourself." The figure stepped forward, pushing back the hood to reveal a woman's face. She was neither young nor old, her eyes a startling shade of gray that seemed to shimmer in the moonlight. "I am Ylva," she said, her voice carrying an otherworldly quality. "Some call me the Whisperer, and I have come to offer you a choice, Bjorn One-Eye." Bjorn lowered his sword, curiosity overcoming his initial wariness. "What choice could you possibly offer me, witch? I am half a man, useless in battle." Ylva smiled, a mysterious curve of her lips. "What if I told you that your greatest strength lies not in what you can see, but in what you cannot?" "Speak plainly," Bjorn growled, his patience wearing thin. "The god Heimdall sees all, hears all," Ylva said, taking a step closer. His gaze pierces the veils between worlds. "What if you could share in that sight, Bjorn? What if your blindness could become your greatest gift?" Bjorn's heart raced at her words. "How?" he whispered, hardly daring to hope. Ylva reached out, her fingers brushing the bandages over his ruined eye. "There is a ritual," she said softly. "Ancient magic, older than the gods themselves. It will not restore your physical sight, but it will grant you visions beyond mortal ken. You will see what is, what was, and what may yet be." Bjorn's mind reeled at the possibilities. To be useful again, to lead his people, but at what cost? "What's the price?" he asked, for surely such power did not come freely. Ylva's gray eyes seemed to look through him, into his very soul. "The price is purpose," she said. "You will be bound to the fate of your people, Bjorn Ragnarsson. Your visions will guide them through the storms to come. Are you prepared for such a burden?" Bjorn looked down at Blooddrinker, still clutched in his hand. Then he gazed out over the fjord, where the first light of dawn was beginning to paint the sky. In that moment he saw two paths stretching before him, one ending here in the cold waters of the fjord, and another leading into an uncertain but vital future. He turned back to Ylva, squaring his shoulders. "I am ready," he said, his voice firm with newfound resolve. "Show me this ritual, Ylva the Whisperer. Let me become the eyes of my people." Ylva nodded, a look of approval crossing her face. "Then come," she said, turning towards the forest. "We have much to do before the sun rises." As Bjorn followed her into the shadows of the pines, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. His journey was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. Whatever trials lay ahead, he would face them not as Bjorn the Blinded, but as Bjorn Heimdallson, the seer of the North. The fate of his people now rested in his hands, and in the visions that would soon fill his mind. The thought both terrified and exhilarated him. As the trees closed in around them, Bjorn sent a silent prayer to the gods, not for protection, but for the strength to bear the burden that was to come. For in the darkness of his blindness, Bjorn had found a new purpose, and with it, a chance to become something far greater than he had ever been before. The longship's hull groaned as it cut through the choppy waters of the fjord. At the stern, Astrid Ironheart stood tall, her golden hair whipping in the wind. Her steel-gray eyes were fixed on the distant shoreline, where smoke rose from a cluster of buildings, the hall of Jarl Eirik the Red. "Steady now," Astrid called to her crew. "Remember, we're here to negotiate first. The axes come out only if words fail." A low chuckle rippled through the warriors. They knew their leader's negotiations often ended in bloodshed, but none would dare question her methods. Astrid had earned their loyalty through courage and cunning, leading them to victory after victory. As they neared the shore, Astrid's second-in-command, Torsten, approached her. "The men are restless, Astrid. They say Eirik will never agree to your terms." Astrid's lips curled into a wolfish grin. "Then we'll give him a choice he can't refuse." The longship ground to a halt on the pebbly beach. Astrid leapt over the side, landing with cat-like grace. Her armor clinked softly, a blend of mail and leather, adorned with runes of protection. At her hip hung Soul Reaver, the axe that had claimed countless lives. "Jarl Eirik," Astrid's voice boomed across the beach. "Come out and face me, you old goat, or are you too busy hiding behind your thralls?" For a moment silence reigned. Then the great doors of the hall burst open, and out strode Eirik the Red, flanked by his housecarls. The Jarl was a bear of a man, his beard streaked with gray and his belly straining against his mail shirt. "Astrid Ironheart," Eirik growled, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword. "You've got some nerve showing your face here after what you did to my son." Astrid laughed, a sound as sharp as the blade of an axe. "Your son got what he deserved, Eirik. I warned him not to raid my lands. It's not my fault he was too stupid to listen." Eirik's face flushed red with anger. "State your business and be gone, Shield Maiden, before I decide to mount your head on my gate." "My business is simple," Astrid replied, taking a step forward. Her warriors tensed, ready for action. "Your clan has grown weak, Eirik. Your raids bring in less plunder each year and your people suffer for it. I'm here to offer you a chance to join my banner. Together we could rule all of Norway." A chorus of jeers erupted from Eirik's men. The old Jarl spat on the ground. "I'd sooner kiss a troll's arse than bend the knee to you, girl." Astrid's eyes narrowed. "Then you leave me no choice, old man. I challenge you to Holmgang. Here and now, before gods and men, the winner takes all." A hush fell over the assembled warriors. Holmgang was sacred, a duel that could not be refused without losing all honor. Eirik's face paled, but he knew he was trapped. "Very well," he growled, drawing his sword. "Let's see if you fight as well as you talk, Ironheart." Astrid unsheathed Soul Reaver, its edge glinting in the pale sunlight. "Oh, I do much better, Eirik, I do much better." The two leaders circled each other on the beach, their followers forming a ring around them. Eirik struck first, his sword whistling through the air. Astrid ducked under the blow, feeling the wind of its passage ruffle her hair. She retaliated with a lightning-fast series of strikes, her axe a blur of motion. Eirik managed to parry most, but one caught him on the shoulder, drawing first blood. "You've slowed, old man," Astrid taunted, dancing out of reach. "Too many winters by the fire, eh?" Eirik roared in fury, charging forward with his sword raised high. It was the opening Astrid had been waiting for. She sidestepped at the last moment, bringing Soul Reaver around in a vicious arc. The axe bit deep into Eirik's side, finding the gap between his mail links. The Jarl stumbled, his sword falling from nerveless fingers. Astrid stood over him, Soul Reaver dripping red. "Yield, Eirik, Yield and live. But there was no yield in the old Jarl's eyes, only hatred and desperation. With a final surge of strength, he lunged for Astrid's legs. Soul Reaver fell once more, and Eirik the Red moved no more. Silence reigned on the beach. Astrid turned to face Eirik's shocked followers, her voice ringing out clear and strong. The old way is done. Eirik fell to his own stubbornness and pride. I offer you a new path, one of strength and prosperity. Join me, and together we'll make our names echo through the halls of Valhalla. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then slowly, one of Eirik's housecarls stepped forward. He was young, with fire in his eyes and ambition written across his face. I am Halfdan, son of Eirik, he declared. And I say we listen to what Astrid Ironheart has to offer. A murmur ran through the crowd. Astrid smiled, extending her hand to Halfdan. A wise choice, young wolf. Your father's stubbornness did not pass to you. As Halfdan clasped her arm, a cheer went up from both sides. The battle was won without further bloodshed, exactly as Astrid had planned. In the days that followed, Astrid moved swiftly to consolidate her power. She called a thing, a gathering of all free men, to formally recognize her as the new Jarl. The great hall buzzed with excitement and tension. Warriors from both clans mingled uneasily, hands never straying far from their weapons. Astrid sat in the high seat, Soul Reaver across her lap, her eyes scanning the crowd. Torsten approached, his voice low. There's dissent among some of the older warriors, Astrid. They say a woman has no right to be Jarl. Astrid's lip curled in a snarl. Then let them challenge me. I'll show them what this woman can do. As if on cue, a grizzled warrior stepped forward from the crowd. His beard was shot through with gray and scars crisscrossed his arms. I am Gunnar Bearslayer, he growled, and I say Astrid Ironheart has no right to sit in that chair. Being clever with an axe doesn't make you fit to lead. A hush fell over the hall. All eyes turned to Astrid, waiting to see how she would respond to this challenge. Slowly, deliberately, Astrid rose from the high seat. She descended the steps, Soul Reaver in hand, until she stood face to face with Gunnar. You think I'm not fit to lead, old man? Her voice was soft, but it carried to every corner of the hall. Let me tell you what makes a leader. It's not just skill with a weapon, though I have that in plenty. It's vision. It's the ability to see beyond the next raid, the next winter. She began to pace, her eyes never leaving Gunnar's. I see a future where our people don't just survive, but thrive. Where we're not just feared, but respected. Where our children grow up strong and our elders die with honor, not hunger. Astrid's voice rose, filled with passion and conviction. I've sailed further than any of you. I've seen the riches of the southern lands, the weakness of their kings. We have the strength to take it all, but only if we stand united. She whirled to face the entire hall now, her arms spread wide. Join me, and I swear by all the gods I will lead us to glory beyond your wildest dreams. Our names will be remembered in sagas for 1,000 years. The hall erupted in cheers. Warriors pounded their shields, caught up in Astrid's vision. Even Gunnar looked shaken, the challenge dying on his lips. Astrid turned back to him, her voice low once more. So, Gunnar Bearslayer, do you still think me unfit to lead? The old warrior hesitated for a moment, then slowly sank to one knee. No, Jarl Astrid, I was wrong. Lead us, and we will follow. A triumphant smile spread across Astrid's face. She raised Soul Reaver high, her voice ringing out over the cheering crowd. Then let it be known. From this day forward we are one people, under one banner, the banner of Astrid Ironheart. The roar that followed shook the very timbers of the hall. Astrid returned to the high seat, her heart pounding with exhilaration. She had done it. She had united the clans under her rule. But as the celebration raged around her, Astrid's mind was already racing ahead. This was just the beginning. There were more clans to unite, more lands to conquer. And beyond that, her eyes drifted to the great map carved into the wall of the hall. It showed Norway, yes, but also the lands beyond. England, Ireland, the far shores of Francia, all ripe for the taking. Soon, Astrid whispered to herself, her fingers tracing the coastlines on the map. Soon, the whole world will know the name of Astrid Ironheart. As if in answer, a cold wind gusted through the hall, making the torches flicker. For just a moment, Astrid thought she saw something in the shadows. A figure, tall and one-eyed, watching her with an unreadable expression. But when she blinked, it was gone. Shaking off the strange feeling, Astrid turned back to her celebrating warriors. There would be time for omens and portents later. For now, there was a new era to usher in, and a destiny to fulfill. The saga of Astrid Ironheart, the shield maiden who would reshape the North, had only just begun. The night sky blazed with an otherworldly light. Streaks of crimson and emerald danced across the heavens, casting an eerie glow over the fjord. Astrid Ironheart stood at the edge of the great hall, her eyes fixed on the unnatural aurora. A chill ran down her spine, one that had nothing to do with the biting cold. "By the gods," Torsten whispered, coming to stand beside her. "I've never seen the sky weep blood like this." Astrid's hand tightened on the hilt of Soul Reaver. "Neither have I, old friend. And I fear it bodes ill for us all." As if in answer to her words, a bone-chilling howl echoed across the fjord. It was followed by another, then another, until the night was filled with the mournful cries of wolves. "The wild hunt," Torsten muttered, making the sign against evil. "Odin rides tonight." Astrid squared her shoulders, pushing down the fear that threatened to rise in her chest. She was Jarl now, leader of a united clan. She couldn't afford to show weakness. "Gather the elders and the Gothi," she commanded. "We need to know what this means." As Torsten hurried off, Astrid's gaze was drawn back to the blood-red sky. In the dancing lights, she could almost see shapes forming. Armies clashing, ships burning. A great wolf with jaws wide enough to swallow the sun. "What are you trying to tell me?" she whispered to the uncaring heavens. The great hall was packed, the air thick with tension and the smoke from the central hearth. Astrid sat in the high seat, her advisors arrayed around her. Before them stood Gyda, the ancient Gothi of their clan, her blind eyes milky white in the firelight. "Speak, Gyda," Astrid commanded. "What do the gods say about these omens?" The old woman raised her gnarled staff, tapping it 3 times on the earthen floor. "The signs are clear, Jarl Astrid. The world trembles on the brink of great change. The blood aurora heralds the coming of war, not just any war, but one that will shake the very foundations of Midgard." Murmurs rippled through the assembled crowd. Astrid leaned forward, her voice low and intense. "What kind of war, Gyda? Against whom do we fight?" Gyda's sightless eyes seemed to fix on Astrid, sending a shiver through the warrior woman. "It is not just a war of men, child. The barriers between worlds grow thin. Giants stir in Jotunheim, and the great wolf Fenrir strains against his bonds." "Ragnarok," someone whispered, the words spreading through the hall like wildfire. "Nonsense," Halfdan, son of the fallen Jarl Eirik, spoke up. "These are just stories to frighten children. We have real enemies to worry about, the Danes to the south, the Swedes to the east." Astrid held up a hand, silencing him. "Do not be so quick to dismiss the wisdom of the gods, Halfdan. But you're right, we cannot ignore the threats of this world while we worry about the next." She turned back to Gyda. "What would you have us do, wise one?" The Gothi was silent for a long moment, her wrinkled face creased in concentration. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Seek the one-eyed seer, Jarl Astrid. He who bears Heimdall's gift. Only through his sight can you hope to navigate the storms to come." Confusion rippled through the hall. Astrid's brow furrowed. "A one-eyed seer? I know of no such man." "He will come to you," Gyda replied cryptically. "When the time is right, he will come." Before Astrid could press for more information, A commotion erupted at the entrance to the hall. A young shepherd boy burst in, his face pale with fear. "Jarl Astrid," he cried. "The sheep, they're all dead." The scene in the pastures was one of carnage. Dozens of sheep lay scattered across the blood-soaked grass, their bodies torn and mutilated. Astrid knelt beside one of the carcasses, her experienced eye taking in the savage wounds. "No wolf did this," she muttered. "Nor any bear I've ever seen." Torsten stood nearby, his face grim. Could it be some kind of sickness? A plague sent by the gods? Astrid shook her head. "Look at the wounds, Torsten. Something ripped these animals apart. But what creature could do this to an entire flock in a single night?" As if in answer, a ear-splitting roar echoed from the nearby forest. Birds exploded from the treetops in panic. Astrid was on her feet in an instant, soul reaver in hand. "Form ranks," she shouted to her warriors. "Whatever did this might still be out there." The men hastily assembled, shields interlocking to form a wall. Astrid took her place at the front, her eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. For a long, tense moment, nothing happened. Then, with a crash of breaking branches, something enormous burst from the forest. Astrid's breath caught in her throat. It was a wolf, but like no wolf she had ever seen. It stood as tall as a horse, its fur matted with blood and its eyes glowing with an unholy light. "Fenrir," someone whispered in terror. Whether it was truly the legendary wolf of myth or some monstrous offspring, Astrid knew they faced a creature of legend. She raised Soul Reaver high, her voice ringing out clear and strong. "Stand fast, warriors of the north. We are the children of Odin, and we fear no beast." The monstrous wolf charged, its jaws wide enough to swallow a man whole. Astrid met its rush head-on, Soul Reaver flashing in the pale light. The battle that followed would be sung of in Scalds' tales for generations to come. Astrid fought like one possessed, her axe a blur of motion as she ducked and weaved around the creature's savage attacks. Her warriors supported her, jabbing with spears and raining arrows upon the beast. But for every wound they inflicted, the wolf seemed to grow stronger, more frenzied. Warriors fell to its claws and fangs, their screams mixing with the monster's howls. Just when it seemed the battle was lost, a new voice cut through the chaos. "Astrid Ironheart, the eye! Strike for its eye!" Astrid whirled to see a stranger standing at the edge of the battlefield. He was a tall man, his left eye covered by a patch, the right blazing with an intensity that made her pause. There was no time to question. The wolf was upon her again, its fetid breath hot on her face. With a war cry that would have made the Valkyries proud, Astrid leapt, bringing Soul Reaver down in a mighty arc. The axe found its mark, sinking deep into the creature's right eye. The wolf let out a howl of agony that shook the very earth. It thrashed wildly, nearly taking Astrid's arm off as she wrenched her weapon free. With a final earth-shaking roar, the monstrous wolf turned and fled back into the forest, leaving a trail of blood in its wake. Silence fell over the battlefield. Astrid stood, chest heaving, covered in blood, both hers and the beast's. Slowly she turned to face the one-eyed stranger. "Who are you?" she demanded. "How did you know?" The man stepped forward, and Astrid saw that his remaining eye was a startling shade of blue, a blue that seemed to hold depths beyond mortal ken. "I am Bjorn," he said, his voice carrying an otherworldly quality. "Once called Ragnarsson, now named Heimdallsson, and I have seen this day in visions of fire and blood." Astrid's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "The one-eyed seer," she whispered. "Gyda spoke of you." Bjorn nodded solemnly. "I have come, Astrid Ironheart, because the fate of our people hangs in the balance. The wolf you fought today is but a harbinger of what is to come." He gestured to the blood-red sky, where the unnatural aurora still danced. "The barriers between worlds grow thin. Ragnarok approaches, and with it, a threat greater than any our people have ever faced." Astrid looked out over the battlefield, at the bodies of her fallen warriors, and the devastation wrought by a single monstrous wolf. If this was just the beginning. She turned back to Bjorn, her voice firm with resolve. Then we must be ready. Tell me, seer, what must we do to save our people? As Bjorn began to speak of visions and prophecies of gods and giants and the fate of worlds, Astrid felt the weight of destiny settling upon her shoulders. She had sought to unite the clans and conquer new lands. Now, it seemed, she would be fighting for the very survival of Midgard itself. The saga of Astrid Ironheart had taken an unexpected turn, one that would lead her into legend, or to the twilight of the gods themselves. The great hall of Astrid Ironheart buzzed with tension. Jarls from across the north had gathered, summoned by urgent messengers bearing tales of blood auroras and monstrous wolves. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, sweat, and barely contained aggression. Astrid sat in the high seat, her face a mask of calm belying the storm of emotions within. To her right stood Bjorn the seer, his single eye scanning the assembled warriors. To her left, Torsten gripped the haft of his axe, ready for any sign of trouble. "Jarls of the North," Astrid's voice rang out, silencing the murmurs. "I've called you here because a threat looms that endangers not just our individual clans but all of Midgard itself." Snorts of disbelief and muttered curses met her words. Jarl Sigurd the Bear, a mountain of a man with a beard like flame, stepped forward. "Pretty words, Ironheart," he growled. "But we've all heard the tales of your ambition. How do we know this isn't some trick to bring us under your banner?" Astrid's eyes flashed dangerously. "You doubt my word, Sigurd? Perhaps you'd like to challenge it with steel?" Before Sigurd could respond, Bjorn stepped forward, his voice carrying an otherworldly resonance that silenced even the most skeptical Jarls. "I have seen it," he intoned. "The wolf Fenrir strains against his bonds. The world serpent, Jormungandr, stirs in the depths. Surtur's fire giants forge their weapons in Muspelheim. Ragnarok approaches, and with it the twilight of gods and men alike." A hush fell over the hall. Even Sigurd looked shaken. But the silence was short-lived. "Madness," shouted Jarl Erik Stonefist. "You expect us to believe the ravings of a one-eyed madman? Where's your proof, Ironheart?" Astrid's hand tightened on Soul Reaver's haft. "Proof? You want proof, Erik? Step outside and look at the sky that weeps blood. Ask the families of the warriors who fell to the monstrous wolf that attacked my lands." She stood, her voice rising with passion and conviction. "I've seen it with my own eyes, fought it with my own hands. The old tales are awakening, Jarls of the North, and if we don't stand together, we'll fall one by one." The hall erupted into chaos. Jarls argued amongst themselves, some calling for unity, others dismissing the threat as superstition. Astrid watched it all, her frustration mounting. Suddenly the doors of the hall burst open. A young warrior staggered in, his armor stained with blood and soot. "Jarl Astrid," he gasped. "News from the south. The settlement at Vestfjord. It's gone. Burned to ash." Silence fell like a thunderclap. Astrid leaped from the high seat, crossing to the messenger in 3 long strides. "What happened?" she demanded. "Who attacked?" The warrior shook his head, his eyes wide with fear. "No one knows. Survivors spoke of giants, Jarl. Giants wielding weapons of flame. They came from the sea in ships that breathed fire." Murmurs of fear rippled through the assembled Jarls. Astrid turned to face them, her voice hard as iron. "There's your proof, Erik Stonefist. Will you wait until your own hall burns before you believe?" Eric's face had gone pale. He opened his mouth to speak, but was cut off by a booming laugh from Sigurd the Bear. "Giants and magic?" Sigurd sneered. "Seems more likely it was the Danes or the Franks. I say we gather our ships and teach these southern dogs a lesson they won't soon forget." A chorus of agreement rose from several Jarls. Astrid felt the situation slipping away from her. She looked to Bjorn, a silent plea in her eyes. The seer stepped forward, raising his hands for silence. When he spoke, his voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Hear me, Jarls of the North. I was once like you, a warrior who trusted only in steel and strength. But the gods have granted me sight beyond sight. Let me show you what I have seen." With that, Bjorn began to chant in a language older than the hills. The air in the hall grew thick and heavy, and the light seemed to dim. Astrid felt a chill run down her spine as reality itself seemed to waver. Suddenly, the center of the hall was filled with visions. Jarls gasped and stumbled back as they saw giants of flame and ice marching across familiar landscapes. Great serpents rose from the sea, capsizing longships as if they were toys. The sky split open, raining fire and destruction upon the lands of the north. And through it all, a monstrous wolf ran rampant, its jaws wide enough to swallow the sun and moon. The visions faded, leaving the Jarls pale and shaken. Bjorn swayed on his feet, steadied by Torsten's strong hand. Astrid seized the moment. Now do you understand this is no ordinary war we face? It's the war, the one spoken of in the oldest tales. Ragnarok itself comes for us all. She paced before the assembled leaders, her voice ringing with authority. But we are the people of the north. We've survived ice and storm, hunger and hardship. Our ancestors sailed to the edges of the world and beyond. If anyone can face this threat and emerge victorious, it's us. Astrid drew Soul Reaver, holding it high. I propose an alliance, not just of our clans, but of all the peoples of the north. Together we can muster a force to rival the gods themselves. The hall was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, Sigurd the bear stepped forward. His eyes met Astrid's, filled with a newfound respect. I've never been one for fancy words or magic tricks, he rumbled, but I know a true leader when I see one. Sigurd the bear and his clan stand with you, Astrid Ironheart. One by one, the other Jarls came forward, pledging their support. Even Eric Stonefist, his earlier skepticism replaced by grim determination, bent the knee. The Stonefist clan answers the call, he declared. May our enemies shatter against our united strength. As the Jarls swore their oaths, Astrid felt a mix of triumph and trepidation. She had done it, united the clans as she had dreamed. But at what cost? And would it be enough to face the storm that was coming? She turned to Bjorn, who watched the proceedings with his otherworldly gaze. What now, Seer? Where do we go from here? Bjorn's single eye seemed to look through her, into realms beyond mortal ken. Now, Astrid Ironheart, we prepare for the greatest battle Midgard has ever seen, a battle that will determine the fate of all the 9 worlds. As if to punctuate his words, a peal of thunder shook the hall. The Jarls fell silent, looking to Astrid for guidance. She raised Soul Reaver high, her voice ringing with the authority of a true leader. Then let it be known from this day forward, we are no longer separate clans but one people, one army, united against the forces that would destroy our world. A roar of approval shook the timbers of the hall. Warriors pounded their shields, caught up in the fervor of the moment. But as Astrid looked out over her newly forged alliance, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The real challenges, and the true tests of her leadership, lay ahead. Outside, the blood aurora continued to dance across the sky, a constant reminder of the doom that approached. But now, at least, they would face it together. The saga of Astrid Ironheart, the shield maiden who united the North, had entered a new chapter, one that would be sung of in the halls of Valhalla for eternity, if they survived the coming storm. The longship creaked and groaned as it battled against the relentless waves of the northern sea. Icy winds howled across the deck, carrying with them the promise of an early winter. At the prow stood Astrid Ironheart, her golden hair whipping wildly in the gale, her eyes fixed on the horizon where sea met sky in a bleak gray line. How much further, Seer? She called over her shoulder, her voice nearly lost in the wind. Bjorn stood nearby, his one good eye closed in concentration. When he spoke, his words seemed to come from somewhere far beyond the mortal realm. The veil grows thin, he intoned. We approach the edges of Midgard, where the branches of Yggdrasil touch the mortal world. Torsten, ever practical, scowled at the cryptic response. That's all well and good, but will we reach land before this storm tears us apart? As if in answer, a massive wave crashed over the side of the ship, sending warriors scrambling for purchase on the slick deck. Astrid gripped the dragon-headed prow tighter, her knuckles white beneath her gloves. "We'll make it," she declared, as much to herself as to her companions. "We have to." The journey had begun a fortnight ago, shortly after the gathering of the Jarls. Bjorn's visions had spoken of an ancient Völva, a seeress of unparalleled power, who dwelt in the far north at the very edges of the known world. Only she, Bjorn claimed, could provide the knowledge they needed to face the coming Ragnarök. Astrid had chosen her companions carefully, Bjorn, of course, whose sight would guide them, Torsten, her most trusted warrior, Ylva the Whisperer, whose magic might prove crucial, and a handful of her finest fighters. A small crew, but one that could move swiftly and quietly. Now, as they neared their destination, Astrid found herself questioning the wisdom of this quest. They had left their people preparing for war, and here she was chasing visions and myths. Her doubts were interrupted by a shout from the lookout. "Land ho, dead ahead!" Astrid squinted through the driving sleet. At first, she saw nothing but the endless gray of sea and sky. Then, slowly, a dark mass began to take shape on the horizon. As they drew closer, she realized it wasn't land at all, but a towering wall of ice that stretched as far as the eye could see. "By the gods," Torsten breathed, coming to stand beside her. "Is this the end of the world?" Bjorn's voice was grim. "In a manner of speaking. We've reached the frozen wastes where Midgard meets Niflheim, the realm of mist and cold." Astrid scanned the imposing ice wall, searching for any sign of habitation. "And where exactly is this Völva of yours?" The seer pointed to a barely visible dark spot at the base of the ice cliffs. There, the entrance to her cave. As they maneuvered the longship closer, the dark spot resolved into the yawning mouth of a cave, its edges smooth as if carved by giant hands. The air grew colder still, and an unnatural mist began to swirl around the ship. "I don't like this," Ylva muttered, her hand straying to the pouch of runes at her belt. "There's old magic here, older than the gods themselves." Astrid set her jaw, determination overriding her own misgivings. "Old magic or not, we've come too far to turn back now. Prepare to make landfall." The longship ground to a halt on a narrow strip of pebbly beach at the base of the ice cliffs. As the crew secured the vessel, Astrid gathered her chosen companions. "Torsten, you'll stay with the ship and half the crew, if we're not back by nightfall." She paused, considering the perpetual twilight that surrounded them. "Or what passes for nightfall in this forsaken place. Take the ship and return to our people. They'll need every warrior they can get." Torsten looked ready to argue, but a stern glance from Astrid silenced him. He clasped her arm instead, warrior to warrior. "May the gods watch over you, Jarl Ironheart." Astrid nodded, then turned to the others. "Bjorn, Ylva, with me. The rest of you guard the entrance. Let nothing in or out without my say-so." With that, the small party made their way towards the looming cave mouth. As they crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped even further, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The walls of the cave glittered with a strange phosphorescent light, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. They had barely gone 100 paces when a bone-chilling howl echoed through the cavern. Astrid's hand flew to Soul Reaver, the axe humming with an eager bloodlust of its own. "What manner of beast was that?" she hissed. Bjorn's face had gone pale, his single eye wide with recognition. "No beast," he whispered. "Something far worse. Now will you help us or not?" The ancient Völva regarded Astrid for a long moment, her gaze seeming to pierce through flesh and bone to the very soul beneath. Finally she nodded. "Very well, Astrid Ironheart. I will share what I know. But be warned, the price of such knowledge is high. Are you willing to pay it?" Astrid didn't hesitate. "Whatever it takes." Groa's smile was cold and sharp as a midwinter night. "Then follow me, mortals, and pray to your gods that you have the strength to bear what I will show you." With that, she turned and glided deeper into the cave, the phosphorescent light seeming to bend around her. Astrid exchanged glances with her companions, Bjorn grim-faced, Ylva wide-eyed with a mix of fear and excitement. Taking a deep breath, Astrid stepped forward, following the ancient Völva into the depths of the ice cave. With each step, she felt the weight of destiny pressing down upon her shoulders. Whatever lay ahead, she knew that nothing would ever be the same again. As they ventured deeper, the cave walls began to change. The ice gave way to something older, darker, stone carved with runes so ancient they predated written language. Astrid felt a sense of vertigo, as if she were walking not just through space, but through time itself. Finally, they emerged into a vast chamber, its ceiling lost in shadows high above. At the center stood a pool of water so still it resembled a mirror of obsidian. Of the future she had glimpsed in the Well of Erd, and she knew that to falter now would be to condemn not just the North, but all the 9 worlds, to destruction. Astrid raised Soul Reaver high, her voice ringing out clear and strong. "Warriors of the North, children of Odin, this day we face our greatest test, but we are the people who tamed the sea and conquered distant shores. We are the descendants of giants and gods, and we will not go quietly into the long night." A roar went up from her warriors, a sound to rival Fenrir's howl. Astrid turned to face the great wolf, Soul Reaver humming with anticipation in her hands. "Come then, beast," she snarled. "Let's see if the spawn of Loki bleeds as red as any mortal." With that, she charged, her warriors at her heels. Fenrir's massive head swung towards them, jaws opening wide to reveal an abyss lined with teeth the size of swords. The clash, when it came, shook the very foundations of Midgard. Astrid's axe bit deep into Fenrir's leg, drawing first blood. But the wolf seemed barely to notice, sweeping a massive paw that sent warriors flying like leaves in a storm. The battle raged, fierce and terrible. Astrid's warriors fought with a courage born of desperation, harrying the great wolf from all sides. But for every wound they inflicted, Fenrir's fury only seemed to grow. In the midst of the chaos, Astrid caught sight of Bjorn. The seer stood apart from the battle, his single eye blazing with an otherworldly light. As Torsten hurried off, Astrid allowed herself one moment of doubt. Were they truly ready to face not just Fenrir, but the might of Muspelheim as well? But there was no time for such thoughts. Her people needed her to be strong, to be the leader they deserved. With a final nod to Ivaldi, she strode from the forge, her mind already racing with battle plans and strategies. The journey back to Midgard was a blur of haste and tension. Every moment felt precious, every delay an agony. When they finally emerged from the hidden paths between realms, Astrid's heart sank at the sight that greeted them. The sky was choked with ash and smoke, turning day into a hellish twilight. In the distance, great pillars of flame marked the advance of the fire giants. And above it all, the howls of Fenrir and his brood echoed like the death knells of the world itself. "To the Ravenswood," Astrid commanded, her voice carrying over the din of panicked preparations. "We make our stand there, or not at all." As they approached the ancient forest, Astrid was heartened to see that her orders had been followed. Warriors from across the north had gathered, a sea of grim faces and readied weapons. At the edge of the woods, she spotted Bjorn and Ylva, surrounded by a group of newly trained cedar workers. Astrid dismounted, striding towards her advisors. "Report," she demanded. Bjorn's single eye was clouded with worry. "It's bad, Astrid. The giants number in the hundreds, and Fenrir. It's grown. Fed on the fear and destruction it's wrought." Ylva stepped forward, her face pale but determined. "We've woven what protections we can around the Ravenswood. They should slow the advance, give us time to prepare." Astrid nodded, her mind racing. "Good. Distribute the dwarf-forged weapons to our best warriors. Bjorn, I want your cedar workers spread out along the line. Their magic might be our best defense against the giant's fire." As her orders were carried out, Astrid climbed a small rise to address the assembled forces. Looking out over the sea of faces, some familiar, many not, She felt the weight of responsibility settle heavy on her shoulders. "Warriors of the North," her voice rang out, silencing the murmurs of the crowd. "The hour we've prepared for is upon us. Fenrir and the forces of Muspelheim march on our lands, thinking to find us weak and divided." She unsheathed Soul Reaver, holding it high. The axe seemed to pulse with eagerness for the coming battle. "But we are not weak. We are not divided. We are the people of the North, descendants of giants and gods alike. And we will not go quietly into the long night." A roar went up from the assembled warriors, weapons clashing against shields in a thunderous display of defiance. "Let them come," Astrid continued, her voice rising with passion. "Let them taste northern steel and northern courage, and let the skald sing of this day for 1,000 years to come." As the cheers reached a fever pitch, Astrid felt a surge of pride and determination. Whatever came, they would face it together. But even as she basked in the moment of unity, a shadow of doubt crept into her heart. There was something off, a tension in the air that went beyond the looming battle. Her instincts, honed by years of leadership and warfare, screamed a warning. There was a threat here, one closer than the approaching army of giants and wolf spawn. Astrid's eyes scanned the crowd, searching for any sign of the unease she felt. Most faces showed only grim determination or fierce excitement. But there, at the edge of the gathering, a hooded figure slipped away from the main group, moving with a furtiveness that set alarm bells ringing in Astrid's mind. Without a word to her lieutenants, she leapt from the rise and began to follow, her hand never straying far from Soul Reaver's haft. The figure led her on a winding path through the outskirts of the camp, always staying just ahead, just out of clear sight. Astrid's suspicion grew with each step. This was no mere scout or messenger. This was someone who didn't want to be seen. Finally, in a small clearing just beyond the edge of the camp, the figure stopped. Astrid pressed herself against a tree, straining to hear. "It's done," a voice said, male, vaguely familiar. "The Jarl suspects nothing. When the battle is joined, I'll ensure she's isolated from the main force. You'll have your shot at her then." A second voice responded, this one sending a chill down Astrid's spine. It was deep, resonant, and utterly inhuman. "Good," it rumbled. "Loki will be pleased. With Ironheart fallen, the North's resistance will crumble, and our master will finally be free to take his rightful place among the gods." Astrid had heard enough. She stepped into the clearing, Soul Reaver held ready. "Show yourself, traitor," she snarled. The hooded figure whirled, throwing back his cowl to reveal Halfdan, son of the fallen Jarl Eirik. "Astrid," he gasped, his face a mask of shock and fear. I can explain." But Astrid's attention was fixed on the other presence in the clearing. Where the inhuman voice had come from, the very air seemed to twist and warp, as if reality itself rejected what stood there. "Oh, I think explanations are a bit beyond you now, Halfdan," she said, her voice cold as midwinter ice. "Consorting with Loki's get? Plotting against your own people? There's only one word for that. Treason." Halfdan's shock gave way to a sneer of defiance. "You fool," he spat. "You think you can stand against the tide of Ragnarok? Loki offers a way out, a chance to be on the winning side when the dust settles." "There won't be any dust to settle if Fenrir and his ilk have their way," Astrid retorted. "There won't be a world left to rule." The air shimmered again, and this time Astrid caught a glimpse of something that made her stomach churn. Eyes like pits of flame, a mouth full of needle-sharp teeth, and then it was gone, vanished between one blink and the next. Halfdan used the momentary distraction to draw his sword. "It doesn't matter now," he snarled. "You weren't supposed to find out until it was too late, but I'll remedy that right now." He lunged forward, his blade whistling through the air. But Astrid hadn't survived countless battles by being slow. Soul Reaver met Halfdan's sword with a clash of sparks, the dwarf-forged metal easily turning aside the lesser blade. "You never could beat me in the training yard, Halfdan," Astrid taunted, circling warily. "What makes you think you can do it now?" With a roar of frustration, Halfdan attacked again, his sword a blur of desperate strikes. But Astrid met each one, her movements fluid and precise. She had been holding back, she realized. Part of her still saw Halfdan as the brash young warrior she had once mentored. That hesitation nearly cost her. Halfdan's blade slipped past her guard, opening a shallow cut on her arm. The sting of it shocked Astrid back to the reality of the situation. This wasn't a training bout. This was life or death. Enough, she growled. In a move too fast for Halfdan to follow, Astrid feinted left, then brought Soul Reaver around in a vicious arc. The axe bit deep into Halfdan's sword arm, nearly severing it at the elbow. Halfdan screamed, his weapon clattering to the ground as he collapsed. Astrid stood over him, Soul Reaver raised for a killing blow. "Wait!" Halfdan gasped, his face pale with pain and fear. "Mercy, Astrid, I was wrong, I see that now." Astrid hesitated, searching Halfdan's face for any sign of sincerity. But all she saw was the same cunning, the same self-serving ambition that had led him to betray his people. "There's no mercy for traitors," she said softly. "Not with the fate of the world hanging in the balance." But before she could deliver the final strike, a blast of otherworldly energy sent her staggering backward. The shimmering in the air coalesced into a vaguely humanoid shape, its edges blurred and shifting. "Enough of this," the thing that could only be one of Loki's servants hissed. "You've outlived your usefulness, human." With impossible speed it lashed out at Halfdan. There was a sickening crunch, and the traitor's eyes went wide with shock. He opened his mouth to speak, but only blood came out. Astrid watched in horror as Halfdan's body seemed to shrivel, the very life force drained from him in moments. The Loki thing grew more solid, more real, feeding on the stolen vitality. "And now for you, Astrid Ironheart," it said, its voice a symphony of broken glass and screaming winds. "My master sends his regards." Astrid raised Soul Reaver, her heart pounding. She had faced giants, monsters, and the great wolf Fenrir himself. But this was something altogether different, something that didn't belong in the world of men or gods. As the thing lunged for her, its form twisting into something out of nightmare, Astrid sent up a silent prayer to any god that might be listening. The battle for the fate of the North, and perhaps all the 9 worlds, had truly begun. The sky above Ravenswood burned. Great gouts of flame arced through the air, hurled by the advancing army of fire giants. The ancient trees, once thought impenetrable, now crackled and smoldered under the onslaught. And above it all, the monstrous form of Fenrir loomed, a shadow blacker than the smoke-filled sky. Astrid Ironheart stood at the forefront of her assembled forces, Soul Reaver gleaming with an otherworldly light in her hands. The encounter with Halfdan and Loki's servant had left her shaken, but there was no time for doubt. Not now, with the fate of Midgard hanging in the balance. "Hold the line," she roared, her voice carrying over the din of battle preparations. "Remember your training. Trust in each other, and in the strength of the North." Beside her, Bjorn's single eye blazed with the power of Heimdall's sight. "They come," he intoned, his voice distant and echoing. A tide of fire and fury with Fenrir at its head. Astrid nodded grimly. "Then let them come. We'll show them the meaning of northern steel and northern courage." As if in answer to her defiance, a bone-chilling howl split the air. Fenrir had caught their scent. "Cider workers," Astrid called. "Now!" Ylva stepped forward, leading a group of newly trained magic users. They began to chant, their voices rising in an eerie harmony. The air around the Ravenswood shimmer edged and twisted as protective wards sprang into being. No sooner had the magical defenses been erected than the first wave of fire giants crashed against them. The giants were monstrous things, easily twice the height of a man, their skin crackling with inner flame. They beat against the magical barrier with fists like battering rams, each blow sending shockwaves through the assembled defenders. "Archers!" Astrid commanded. "Let fly!" A hail of arrows, their heads forged by dwarven hands and enchanted by cedar, arced over the barrier. Many found their mark, sinking deep into giant flesh. Where they struck, ice bloomed, a stark contrast to the giants' fiery nature. The giants roared in pain and fury, redoubling their efforts to breach the ward. Astrid could see the strain on Ylva's face as she and her apprentices fought to maintain the barrier. "It won't hold much longer," Bjorn warned, his voice tight with tension. Astrid nodded. "It doesn't need to. It just needs to hold long enough." Even as she spoke, a resounding crack echoed across the battlefield. The magical barrier shattered like glass, and the fire giants poured through the gap. "For the north!" Astrid bellowed, raising Soul Reaver high. "For Midgard!" With a roar that would have made their ancestors proud, the warriors of the north met the charge of the fire giants. The clash of steel on giant flesh rang out, punctuated by screams of pain and fury from both sides. Astrid was in the thick of it, Soul Reaver singing its deadly song. The dwarf-forged axe bit deep into giant flesh, its enchanted edge able to pierce even their flame-hardened skin. But for every giant that fell, 2 more seemed to take its place. Through the chaos of battle, Astrid caught glimpses of her companions. Torsten, his face a mask of grim determination, led a wedge of shield warriors, driving back a knot of giants with coordinated precision. Ylva, her hands weaving complex patterns in the air, called down bolts of lightning that struck the invaders with unerring accuracy. And Bjorn was a whirlwind of destruction. His single eye blazed with divine fire as he moved through the battle with impossible speed and grace. Where he struck, giants fell, their flames extinguished by the power of Heimdall flowing through him. For a moment, Astrid allowed herself to hope. They were holding their own, against all odds. Perhaps they could. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sound that shook the very earth beneath her feet. Fenrir had joined the fray. The great wolf tore through the battlefield like a force of nature, friend and foe alike crushed beneath its massive paws. Its jaws, large enough to swallow a longship whole, snapped shut on a group of warriors, their screams cut horrifyingly short. "To me!" Astrid shouted, gathering a group of her best fighters. "We end this now!" They fought their way through the melee, dodging gouts of giant flame and the snapping jaws of Fenrir's lesser offspring. Finally, they stood before the monstrous wolf itself. Fenrir's eyes, burning with infernal fire, fixed upon Astrid. There was intelligence in that gaze, and a hatred older than the world itself. "Fenrir," Astrid called, her voice somehow carrying over the din of battle. "Face me, you overgrown mongrel. Or are you afraid of a mere mortal?" The great wolf's lips pulled back in what might have been a grin, revealing rows of teeth the size of longswords. It spoke, its voice a growl that resonated in Astrid's very bones. "Little mortal," it rumbled. "You think to challenge me? I, who am destined to devour the sun itself." Astrid raised Soul Reaver, the axe humming with anticipation. "Destiny can change, wolf, and I've got an axe here that's hungry for god blood." With a roar that shook the heavens, Fenrir lunged. Astrid dove to the side, feeling the rush of air as massive jaws snapped shut where she had been standing. She rolled to her feet, bringing Soul Reaver around in a vicious arc that bit deep into Fenrir's flank. The wolf howled in pain and fury, whirling with a speed that belied its massive size. Its paw lashed out, catching one of Astrid's warriors and sending him flying. The man hit a tree with a sickening crunch and didn't get up. "Spread out," Astrid commanded. "Don't let it focus on any one of us." Her remaining warriors obeyed, harrying Fenrir from all sides. They darted in and out, their dwarf-forged weapons drawing ichor with each strike. But it wasn't enough. For every wound they inflicted, Fenrir seemed to grow stronger, more frenzied. Astrid's mind raced, searching for a solution. They couldn't outlast the wolf, couldn't overpower it through sheer force. There had to be another way. Suddenly, Bjorn's words from their encounter with the vulva echoed in her mind. Fenrir's eternal enemy. He had called Heimdall. And now Bjorn wielded a portion of Heimdall's power. "Bjorn," Astrid shouted, "your eye, use Heimdall's sight." The seer understood immediately. He closed his mortal eye and opened the other, the eye that saw beyond the veils of reality. Divine fire blazed forth, striking Fenrir like a physical blow. The wolf staggered, momentarily blinded. It was the opening Astrid had been waiting for. With a war cry that would have made the Valkyries proud, she charged. Soul Reaver, powered by her indomitable will and the strength of the North itself, struck true. The axe bit deep into Fenrir's chest, sinking to the haft in godflesh. The wolf let out a howl of agony that shook the very foundations of Midgard. It thrashed wildly, nearly taking Astrid's arm off as she wrenched her weapon free. For a moment, the entire battlefield seemed to hold its breath. Fenrir swayed, black ichor pouring from the wound in its chest. Then, with a sound like the breaking of the world, it fell. The impact shook the earth, sending both defender and invader stumbling. A silence fell over the Ravenswood, broken only by the crackling of flames and the groans of the wounded. Astrid stood over the fallen form of Fenrir, her chest heaving with exertion. The wolf's eyes, once blazing with infernal fire, now dimmed like dying embers. "It's over," she breathed, scarcely daring to believe it. But even as the words left her lips, a cold laugh echoed across the battlefield. A figure materialized beside Fenrir's massive head, tall, lean, with a face that might have been handsome if not for the cruel twist of its lips. "Oh, little mortal," Loki said, for it could be none other than the trickster god himself. "It's far from over. You've played your part admirably, I'll give you that. But did you really think it would be so easy to derail Ragnarok?" With a gesture, Loki sent a wave of sickly green energy washing over Fenrir's form. Before Astrid's horrified eyes, the wolf's wounds began to close, its eyes rekindling with unholy light. "You see," Loki continued, his voice dripping with malicious glee, "Fenrir's defeat was prophesied, but so too was his rise. And now, thanks to you, he's stronger than ever." Fenrir began to stir, its massive form shifting as it regained consciousness. Astrid raised Soul Reaver, though she knew in her heart it would not be enough. Not this time. But before either god or mortal could make a move, a new sound split the air. It was a horn blast, so loud and pure it seemed to make the very air vibrate. Astrid felt it in her bones, a call that spoke of hope and defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. Loki's smug expression faltered. "No," he whispered. "It can't be." From the east, a light began to grow. It was not the ruddy glow of the fire giant's flames, nor the sickly radiance of Loki's magic. This was a pure, golden light that drove back the shadows and made even the gods shield their eyes. And riding that light like the dawn itself given form, came an army such as Midgard had never seen. Einherjar, the chosen warriors of Valhalla, led by none other than Odin himself. The All-Father rode at their head, Gungnir gleaming in his hand, his one eye blazing with the wisdom of ages. "It seems," Odin's voice boomed across the battlefield, "that the mortals have proven themselves worthy of aid. What say you, Loki? Shall we finish this dance once and for all?" As gods and Einherjar crashed into the remains of the giant army, Astrid felt a surge of renewed hope. The battle for Midgard was far from over, but now, at least, they did not fight alone. With a fierce grin, she raised Soul Reaver once more. "Come on, you bastards," she roared. "Let's show these gods how mortals fight." And with that, Astrid Ironheart, Jarl of the North, charged back into the fray. For the fate of Midgard, and all the 9 worlds, hung in the balance, and she, a mere mortal, would have her say in how the story ended. The battlefield was chaos incarnate. The clash of steel on steel mingled with the roars of giants and the battle cries of gods and mortals alike. The very air crackled with energy as divine powers collided, sending shockwaves across the ravaged landscape of Ravenswood. Astrid Ironheart stood at the center of it all, Soul Reaver gleaming with an otherworldly light in her blood-stained hands. Her armor was dented and scorched, her golden hair matted with sweat and gore. But her eyes burned with an indomitable fire as she surveyed the scene before her. To her left, Odin Allfather himself battled against a group of fire giants, Gungnir flashing like lightning as it struck down foe after foe. To her right, Thor's hammer Mjolnir sang its thunderous song as it crushed giant skulls and scattered wolf spawn like leaves in a storm. And there, at the heart of the melee, Loki faced off against his age-old nemesis Heimdall. The two gods moved with impossible speed, their forms blurring as they struck at each other with millennia of pent-up hatred. But Astrid had no time to marvel at the clash of divine powers. Her focus was on a more immediate threat, Fenrir newly revived and more terrible than ever, the great wolf's eyes fixed on her, burning with a hatred older than the world itself. "Little mortal," it growled, its voice shaking the very ground beneath their feet. "You dare to stand against me? Against the tide of Ragnarok itself?" Astrid raised Soul Reaver, her voice ringing out clear and defiant. "I dare, beast. For my people, for Midgard. I dare." With a roar that shook the heavens, Fenrir lunged. Astrid dove to the side, feeling the rush of air as massive jaws snapped shut where she had been standing. She rolled to her feet, bringing Soul Reaver around in a vicious arc that bit deep into Fenrir's flank. The wolf howled in pain and fury, whirling with a speed that belied its massive size. Its paw lashed out, catching Astrid square in the chest and sending her flying. She hit the ground hard, the breath driven from her lungs. As she struggled to her feet, gasping for air, a familiar voice cut through the din of battle. "Astrid!" It was Bjorn, his single eye blazing with Heimdall's power. The eye. Strike for its eye. Understanding dawned. Fenrir was a creature of prophecy, bound by the rules of fate. But Bjorn's gift, Heimdall's sight, allowed him to see beyond those bonds, to find the weak points in destiny itself. Astrid nodded, a plan forming in her mind. "Bjorn," she shouted, "can you blind it, just for a moment?" The seer understood immediately. He closed his mortal eye and opened the other, the eye that saw beyond the veils of reality. Divine fire blazed forth, striking Fenrir full in the face. The wolf reared back, momentarily blinded and disoriented. It was the opening Astrid had been waiting for. With a war cry that would have made her ancestors proud, she charged. Soul Reaver, powered by her indomitable will and the strength of the North itself, struck true. The axe sank deep into Fenrir's left eye socket, black ichor spraying forth in a grotesque fountain. The wolf's howl of agony shook the very foundations of Midgard, sending both god and mortal staggering. But Astrid wasn't done. With a grunt of effort, she wrenched Soul Reaver free and struck again, this time at the wolf's other eye. Fenrir thrashed wildly, its massive paws lashing out in blind fury. One caught Astrid, sending her tumbling across the battlefield. She hit the ground hard, feeling ribs crack under the impact. Through a haze of pain, she saw Fenrir staggering, blood pouring from its ruined eyes. But it wasn't enough. The wolf was wounded, yes, but far from defeated. "Astrid!" The voice was Ylva's, the seeress appearing at her side as if by magic. "The bindings. We can recreate them." Of course. The magical fetters that had once bound Fenrir before Loki's treachery had set it free. But how? As if in answer to her unspoken question, Odin's voice boomed across the battlefield. "The Gleipnir," he called. "Forged from 6 impossible things. Recreate it, mortals, with the power of your belief." Astrid's mind raced. Impossible things. What was more impossible than mortals standing against the tide of Ragnarok? She struggled to her feet, ignoring the screaming pain in her ribs. "Ylva," she gasped, "gather the cedar workers. We're going to bind a god." As Ylva rushed to obey, Astrid raised her voice, calling out to all who could hear. "Warriors of the North, children of Midgard, lend me your strength, your courage, your defiance in the face of fate itself." Around her, the battle seemed to pause as mortal and god alike turned to listen. "We are the impossible things," Astrid continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "The breath of a fish, the roots of a mountain, the sinews of a bear, the spittle of a bird, the beard of a woman, the footsteps of a cat. We are all these things and more. As she spoke, Ylva and her satyr workers began to chant, weaving magic older than the gods themselves. The air around them shimmered and twisted, reality itself bending to the force of their combined will. We are the people who tamed the sea and conquered distant shores. Astrid's voice rang out, clear and strong. We are the descendants of giants and gods, the children of ice and fire. The shimmering in the air began to coalesce, taking on a physical form, a chain of impossible thinness, yet radiating strength beyond mortal comprehension. And we say this, Fenrir, son of Loki. You will not have our world. With a sound like the breaking of fate itself, the new Gleipnir sprang into being. It lashed out, wrapping itself around Fenrir's massive form. The wolf howled in fury and disbelief, thrashing against bonds made from the very essence of mortal defiance. But the Gleipnir held. Fenrir's struggles grew weaker, its howls turning to whimpers as the impossible chain tightened. A cheer went up from the assembled warriors of Midgard, a sound of triumph and disbelief in equal measure. They had done it. They had bound Fenrir anew. But their celebration was short-lived, for even as Fenrir fell, Loki's laughter rang out across the battlefield. "Oh, well done," the trickster god applauded, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You've bound my son once more, but did you really think that was the extent of my plan?" With a gesture, Loki tore a hole in the very fabric of reality. Through it, Astrid could see a realm of fire and shadow, Muspelheim, home of the fire giants. "Behold," Loki crowed, "the true face of Ragnarok. Surtur himself comes to claim Midgard, and all the 9 worlds with it." Through the portal strode a figure that dwarfed even the mightiest of the fire giants. Surtur, lord of Muspelheim, his body wreathed in flames hot enough to melt the very stones beneath his feet. In his hand he held a sword that blazed brighter than the sun, promising the end of all things. Astrid felt her heart sink. They had given everything to bind Fenrir, and now this? How could they hope to stand against such a foe? But then, a hand clasped her shoulder. She turned to see Odin himself standing beside her, his one eye gleaming with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Was it pride? "Well fought, Astrid Ironheart," the Allfather said, his voice resonating with power. "You and your people have proven yourselves worthy 100 times over this day. But now I fear it falls to the gods to finish what you've begun." Before Astrid could respond, Odin raised Gungnir high. "To me, Aesir and Vanir," he called. "Let us meet our fate with courage and honor." As the gods of Asgard rallied to Odin's call, Astrid felt a tugging sensation. The world around her began to blur and fade as if she were being pulled away from the scene. "What's happening?" she demanded, trying to fight against the strange force. Odin's voice seemed to come from very far away. "We send you back, Astrid Ironheart, back to Midgard, to your people. For whatever the outcome of this battle, the world of men must endure." "No," Astrid cried, reaching out as if she could physically hold on to the fading battlefield. "Let me stay. Let me fight." But her protests were in vain. The last thing she saw before the world went dark was Odin turning to face Surtur, Gungnir blazing with the light of 1,000 suns. Then, darkness. Astrid awoke with a gasp, sitting bolt upright. She was in her bed? In her longhouse? How? "Easy there, my Jarl," a familiar voice soothed. It was Ylva, looking exhausted but very much alive. "You've been unconscious for 3 days." 3 days? Astrid's mind reeled. But the battle, Fenrir, Surtur. Ylva's face was a mixture of wonder and confusion. We won, Astrid. Somehow. The giants are gone, Fenrir is bound once more, but the gods..." She trailed off, shaking her head in disbelief. "What about the gods?" Astrid demanded. "They're gone," Ylva said softly. "All of them. Odin, Thor, even Loki. It's as if they never existed. The only proof we have that any of it happened are the scars on the land, and the stories we'll tell." Astrid sat in stunned silence, trying to process it all. They had faced Ragnarok itself and emerged victorious. But at what cost? As if reading her thoughts, Ylva spoke again. The world has changed, Astrid. The age of gods and monsters is over. What comes next, that's up to us. Astrid nodded slowly, her mind already racing with the challenges that lay ahead. Rebuilding, healing, forging a new future for her people in a world without gods. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, ignoring the protests of her battered body. Then we'd best get started, she said, her voice filled with determination. There's work to be done. As she stood, leaning on Ylva for support, Astrid felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders once more. But this time, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like purpose. For Astrid Ironheart, Jarl of the North and defender of Midgard, had stared into the face of Ragnarok itself and emerged unbroken. Whatever challenges the future held, she would meet them head-on. The age of gods might be over, but the age of mortals, of humanity, was just beginning.